Hey guys, tonight we begin with a medieval bureaucrat, the most dangerous creature in history. The Middle Ages were a crucible of nascent civilization, a sprawling tapestry woven with threads of faith, fear, and an often bewildering lack of common sense. It was a time when the world was both shrinking and expanding, when grand cathedrals reached for the heavens, and humble villagers lived lives governed by superstitions as potent as any law. This era, so distant from our own, was full of bizarre laws, but what most people don't know is that many of them, the truly unbelievable ones, didn't spring from grand philosophical debates or enlightened legal codification. Oh no, they existed because of one incredibly stupid, chaotic, or downright unbelievable event, an isolated moment of sheer medieval absurdity that, through a chain of rigid logic and unwavering faith, blossomed into a binding decree. It's hard to imagine, but in medieval France, a pig once stood trial for murder and lost. The year was a tumultuous 1386, a century scarred by the Black Death, a period ripe for both profound piety and staggering irrationality, and somewhere in the quiet, mud-strewn lanes of the French town of Filets, a pig, an ordinary sow of indeterminate age, and even less distinguished lineage, made history by becoming the first defendant with hooves. One crisp morning, this ordinary sow, nameless, guiltless, and very possibly just hungry, wandered into the street. Driven by instinct, or perhaps the primal urge for sustenance, it attacked a small child, inflicting wounds that would prove fatal. Tragic, absolutely. A devastating loss for the child's family, and a stark reminder of the harsh realities of rural life in the medieval world. But this, remember, was the Middle Ages, where logic sometimes took centuries, long naps. So instead of, say, simply eating the offending pig and mourning the child, or shrugging it off as an unfortunate, if grisly, aspect of farm life, the townsfolk, guided by a legal philosophy that saw all creatures as part of God's moral order, decided to put it on trial for murder. Yes, a full trial. Picture the scene: a makeshift courtroom, perhaps in the town hall or even a church antechamber, packed with solemn-faced villagers. There were judges, robed in the customary dignity of their office, attempting to project an air of profound wisdom as they presided over this most unusual of cases. Witnesses were called, some perhaps still trembling from the sight of the incident, recounting the pig's ferocious assault. The creature itself, a bewildered, grunting sow, was brought before the court, chained and formally charged. It was accused not merely of a random act of violence, but of acting with malice aforethought, a legal term typically reserved for human intent. If true, this would indeed make it one of the most intelligent, and certainly most malevolent, pigs in recorded history. A defense lawyer was assigned, a requirement of due process even for livestock, probably the most awkward gig in legal history. Imagine standing in front of a medieval jury comprised of men who genuinely believed in the spiritual accountability of animals, trying to argue for a pig's innocence. My client? One could almost hear him say, his voice strained with professional obligation, "Hoinks in protest, Your Honour," asserting its fundamental right to forage. The judge listened, nodded gravely, perhaps stroking a contemplative beard, and then, with all the gravitas he could muster, declared the sow guilty, because, of course, pigs, in their theological understanding, were notorious repeat offenders, fully capable of moral transgressions. The punishment? Death by hanging. The same method used for humans, because consistency, after all, matters in jurisprudence, even when dealing with farm animals. The town gathered to watch, a spectacle, both gruesome and bizarre, demonstrating a peculiar blend of piety and entertainment. The pig was reportedly dressed in human clothes, a rough shirt, breeches, and perhaps even a tiny cap, led to the gallows and executed in front of an enthusiastic crowd. Nothing says civilization quite like a public execution of farm animals, designed to reassert the cosmic order that an errant pig had dared to disrupt. This truly peculiar trial caused such a stir, with its implicit assumption of ecclesiastical oversight over all living things, that the Bishop of Autun had to intervene. Apparently, people had started executing livestock without explicit church approval, which was, naturally, a big no-no. It challenged the church's ultimate authority over moral judgment, even for beasts. So, a new, meticulously worded law was passed. No animal could be tried or executed without ecclesiastical authorization. In other words, even pigs now needed permission from God's middle management before facing earthly judgment. The precedent stuck, a testament to the enduring power of bureaucratic and religious authority. Soon, Europe was full of criminal animals, roosters, tried for witchcraft, often for the unnatural act of laying eggs, as we'll hear later, goats accused of immorality, usually for perceived lechery or satanic associations, and cows fined for trespassing. Humanity, in its glorious medieval wisdom, had officially reached peak accountability, extending legal personhood to the entire animal kingdom. Everything, it seemed, had rights and responsibilities, except perhaps the humans who suffered under these increasingly absurd laws. It's easy to laugh now, to dismiss this as quaint medieval madness. But in medieval logic, everything, every creature great and small, existed in God's vast, interconnected moral ecosystem. And if that ecosystem went rogue, if an animal violated divine or human law, someone had to hang for it. Unfortunately, that someone was usually Bacon. If there's one thing the medieval era excelled at, besides dying young and inventing unnecessarily complex laws, it was taking jokes too far. Sometime in the mid-14th century, in the verdant, rolling lands of Bohemia, a bored nobleman, whose name is sadly lost to the mists of time, decided that the traditional jesting tournaments were getting dreadfully repetitive. Same horses, same lances, same predictable concussions. He yearned for something novel. So, with an audacious flash of inspiration, he showed up to a jest with something no one, not even the most seasoned jesting enthusiast, expected: a goose. Not a roasted goose, destined for the banquet table. Not a pet goose, tethered by a silken cord. No, this was a fully armoured goose. According to local chronicles, which painstakingly recorded this moment of magnificent lunacy, the knight had commissioned a tiny, meticulously crafted set of plate armour for the bird. It was a miniature marvel, complete with a gleaming breastplate, tiny leg guards, and a perfectly scaled miniature helmet, presumably with eye slits for the goose's limited vision. He proudly declared it his squire, a feathered companion in arms, and paraded it around the tilt-yard with a flourish. He even bestowed upon it a grand, if somewhat whimsical, name Sir Hiss of the Pond. Because why not give your poultry a title worthy of a chivalric romance? It was all supposed to be a grand jest, a moment of aristocratic levity, until, quite abruptly, it wasn't. During the cacophonous event, amidst the thundering hooves and clanking steel, the goose, perhaps startled by the noise or simply feeling its martial oats, apparently escaped. It flapped across the field in a blur of iridescent feathers and polished metal, a sight that must have been both ludicrous and terrifying. One unfortunate squire, perhaps tasked with wrangling the avian combatant, bravely or foolishly tried to grab it. The goose, embodying its newly granted chivalric spirit, bit him fiercely on the hand, then promptly, and with astonishing velocity, rammed into a horse's legs. The horse, a massive warhorse trained for battle, but not for avian assault, panicked. It reared, threw its rider, a knight of considerable renown, and chaos erupted across the jousting field. By the time the dust settled, 3 knights lay injured, their pride bruised and their dignity shattered. The goose was tragically dead, a casualty of its own misplaced bravery, and everyone had learned a valuable, if absurd, lesson: birds make terrible armour-bearers. Naturally, instead of simply laughing it off as an unfortunate, if hilarious incident, the authorities reacted the medieval way by legislating it. A stern decree was swiftly issued, a testament to the bureaucratic mind's ability to find order in even the most peculiar chaos. The law banned the dressing, arming, or mounting of animals in imitation of noble combatants. The ruling also extended to beasts of burden, fowl, and pets of domestic origin, which in legal Latin is a wonderfully precise way of saying, "Don't give your chicken a sword." The story, propelled by its sheer absurdity, spread like wildfire across Central Europe, becoming a running joke among knights who secretly, perhaps, envied the goose's raw courage. Some even claimed it was cursed, that the valiant spirit of Sir Hiss haunted jests forever, flapping invisibly over tilting fields, whispering a feathered challenge, "You'll never be as brave as me." Still, the law remained on the books for decades, a curious relic in parchment. Future generations, poring over dusty legal tomes, read it utterly confused and wondered what monumental catastrophe could possibly have inspired such a specific prohibition. The answer, of course, was one very determined goose and one knight with far too much free time. Proof that even in the Middle Ages, stupidity, sometimes, had wings. If you ever think your job is stressful, remember that in medieval Germany people's hobbies involved riding 600 Koj warhorses at full speed while holding a 14-foot spear and drinking heavily before doing it. In 1364, a nobleman named Count Hinrich von Schwarzburg showed up to a jesting tournament absolutely plastered. This wasn't entirely unusual, mind you. Knights were generally expected to drink, partly because medieval water could kill you faster than the tournament itself, and partly because a certain amount of liquid courage was deemed essential for facing certain death. But Heinrich took it a step further. He was a vocal proponent of what he called spiritual fortification, insisting he fought better while liberally imbibing. He was technically right. The spirit part of the fortification just wasn't supposed to be literal. Accounts say he entered the arena swaying precariously in the saddle, a magnificent, if wobbly, figure. He dropped his massive lance 3 times before even reaching the starting line, yet still shouted with unwavering conviction, "Let the glory of Saint Michael guide my aim." Seconds later, in a spectacular display of alcoholic misjudgment, he missed his opponent entirely. His lance, instead of striking armor, found a nearby monk who had been piously praying for everyone's safety from the sidelines, impaling him with shocking precision, which you have to admit is darkly poetic. The scandal was immediate, a whirlwind of outrage and horrified gasps. The church was understandably horrified. The crowd, meanwhile, was morbidly entertained, their initial shock quickly giving way to a mixture of awe and nervous laughter. The monk, miraculously, survived, though he reportedly spent the rest of his long life avoiding all outdoor events, especially those involving mounted combatants. The local duke, a man of practical sense who realized this could quickly turn into another pig trial situation, called an emergency council. The result was a brand new, groundbreaking law. No knight shall compete in tournament or trial of arms while under the influence of drink or fermented brew. It was, in essence, Europe's first recorded anti-drunk driving regulation, except the vehicles were horses and the airbags were, regrettably, monks. Naturally, knights across the Holy Roman Empire protested with indignant fury. They claimed alcohol calmed the nerves and steadied the hand, which might have been true if the hand wasn't attempting to wield a 14-foot spear with pinpoint accuracy while galloping at full tilt. The church, however, backed the ban with uncharacteristic fervour, arguing that a sober knight honoured God through discipline. The knights, ever pragmatic, replied, "A sober knight loses sponsors." Thus began the great medieval debate between piety and party culture, a clash of sacred duty and fermented pleasure. Despite the law, enforcement was notoriously tricky. Jousting officials weren't exactly equipped with breathalyzers. The best they could do was sniff helmets, a rather unreliable method. Still, the drunken jest decree became official law throughout the Holy Roman Empire. It didn't stop knights from drinking, of course. It just made them more creative about when, where they did it, often leading to pre-tournament spiritual fortification that was carefully timed to wear off just before entering the lists, and that's how one inebriated noble turned medieval chivalry into a cautionary tale. Proof that even in armour, stupidity finds a way. In medieval England, bread wasn't just food, it was politics you could eat. Every loaf, every crust, every crumb was meticulously regulated by law. Bakers had to follow the size of bread an aisle, a comprehensive statute that dictated precise standards for size, weight and price, often down to the very ounce. This was a critical measure in a society where bread was the staple of life, ensuring fair trade and preventing famine. But nowhere in the voluminous legal texts of the realm did it mention a shape. Not until one ambitious baker, possessed of either an artistic flair or a catastrophic lack of judgment, ruined everything. Sometime in the mid-14th century, a baker in the bustling metropolis of London decided to show off. Perhaps he was bored with the endless rows of plain, utilitarian loaves. Perhaps he yearned for attention, a splash of creativity in his doughy domain. Or perhaps he simply didn't understand the profound implications of the word humble. He baked a truly beautiful, perfectly round loaf, but with an ill-fated flourish, an embossed, decorative ring around the top crust. Unfortunately, that ring, in its innocent beauty, looked exactly like the king's crown. Within days, the royal loaf was a sensation at the market. People flocked to buy it, intrigued by its regal appearance. One customer, perhaps with a mischievous glint in his eye, even joked aloud, "Why, this looks fit for His Majesty's table!" In a society where sarcasm, particularly directed at the crown, could be construed as a capital offence, that seemingly harmless comment was enough to start an inquest. Word, carried by nervous whispers and zealous informants, reached a royal official, a man whose job was to sniff out even the faintest whiff of sedition. He took one look at the offending bread and, with a terrifying flash of insight, decided that treason had quite literally entered the bakery. The baker, a man whose only crime was an excess of artistic ambition, was dragged before a magistrate, accused of mocking the image and authority of the crown through insolent baking, which, if nothing else, proves medieval lawyers possessed incredibly vivid imaginations. He was fined heavily, a sum that likely crippled his business, and forced to endure the ignominy of standing in the stocks. The round crown like bread hung around his neck for all to see. It was the first known case of public carb shaming, a grim warning to all who dared to get creative with their cuisine. To prevent any future bread-based blasphemy, Parliament, in its infinite wisdom, swiftly issued a new regulation. No loaf was to bear royal or sacred resemblance in shape or design. In short, bake all you want, but for God's sake, don't get artistic. Creativity, when it touched upon symbols of power, was now a crime. It sounds utterly ridiculous, an absurd overreaction to a simple pastry. But this wasn't an isolated case of paranoia. Medieval rulers lived in constant fear of symbolic rebellion. People might not openly criticize the crown. That was far too dangerous. But they could mock it, even in the seemingly innocuous form of a well-baked pastry. And nothing scared kings quite like the idea that commoners might find humour in their divinely ordained authority. So yes, one overly decorative loaf of bread, a simple, delicious ring of dough, gave birth to the first anti-satire law in English culinary history, forever shaping the way bakers approach their craft. The moral, in medieval Europe, never let your food look smarter or more powerful than your king. Because in a world where you could be executed for puns, baking fancy bread was practically revolution. Monks were supposed to be the very picture of discipline, silent, devoted, and most certainly not remixing ancient Gregorian hymns into popular tavern love songs. Unfortunately, not everyone in the cloistered confines of the medieval monastery agreed with this strict interpretation of monastic life. The story begins in 14th century Italy, a land of soaring cathedrals and equally soaring passions, where a group of Benedictine monks, perhaps suffering from an excess of pious routine, decided to add a little as passion to their chanting. Gregorian hymns, while spiritually uplifting, were undeniably repetitive, slow, and, to some of the younger, more spirited brothers, depressingly holy. So, one starless night, a particularly creative monk, whose name has been lost to the annals of monastic shame, although historians strongly suspect that a generous quantity of monastery wine was involved, slipped in a few verses. These weren't from obscure saints' lives or forgotten psalms. They were brazenly borrowed from a popular tavern tune, a bawdy ballad about a maiden fair and faithless, her eyes like stars, her heart like stone. The rhythm, so different from the slow drone of traditional chant, caught on. Soon, half the abbey was humming it between prayers, a clandestine melody weaving its way through the sacred silence. At first, the venerable abbot, a man of considerable patience, chose to ignore it, perhaps chalking it up to youthful exuberance or a momentary lapse in devotion. Then, one crisp morning, he caught two monks, flushed with clandestine glee, openly rehearsing harmonies in the cloister, their voices echoing with forbidden zeal. Worse, they were blasphemously calling it the Song of Saint Cecilia's Ice, appropriating a saint's name for their profane creation. You can imagine the confusion when genuine pilgrims, arriving at the monastery seeking spiritual solace, started innocently requesting the track from the bewildered choirmaster. It escalated from there with alarming speed. Vespers, the evening prayer service, began to resemble a nightly concert. The brothers, growing bolder, began sneaking instruments into the chapel, a lute here, a small drum there, their forbidden melodies growing louder and more intricate, until one climactic night, a monk, utterly devoid of self-preservation, brought in a tambourine. The jingling, rattling percussive assault was the final straw. The abbot snapped. He summoned the entire choir, a truly mortified ensemble, and delivered a fiery sermon about temptation, spiritual corruption, and the proper sonic reverence due to God. He concluded with a thunderous declaration, announcing a new rule that would go down in monastic history. No singing or musical performance shall occur after the hour of sunset. In other words, the world's first medieval noise complaint, a legal silencing of nocturnal creativity. Naturally, the monks were furious. They argued vehemently that music in all its forms brought them closer to God, elevating their souls. The abbot, unmoved, replied with a withering gaze that God probably preferred silence, especially after dark. The next evening, the monastery fell quiet, an eerie, unnatural hush. Until, that is, someone, perhaps the original wine-fueled innovator, started whistling the forbidden tune, with infuriating clarity, from behind the wine cellar. The punishment was swift and brutal fasting, which in monastic terms is the equivalent of being grounded indefinitely, but with far less food. Within months, neighbouring abbeys, wary of disruptive nocturnal chanting echoing across the valleys, copied the regulation. Word eventually spread to Rome, where one cardinal reportedly commented with wary exasperation, "If monks must sing, let it be soberly, not seductively." The ban, a testament to the enduring power of bureaucratic control, survived for centuries, long after the very abbey that birthed it had burned down. The irony, a delicious, historically significant irony, is that those same rebellious monks, in their quest for forbidden melodies, accidentally invented early polyphony, the very musical foundation of European choral art. So the next time you hear a soaring church choir, perhaps thank a few rebellious medieval monks who got tired of monotony, added a beat, and got legally silenced for it. Because even holiness, apparently, had a bedtime. Few things capture medieval thinking better than this next anecdote. A nobleman once accused peasants of getting his fish drunk. The story takes place in 15th century England, a land still reeling from wars and plagues, but still holding on to its peculiar customs. Lord Humphrey of Catterick was a man of considerable means, owning a grand estate, several fine horses, and a disturbingly personal relationship with his carp pond. These weren't just any fish to Lord Humphrey. He named them, fed them choice morsels, and according to one whimsical account, spoke to them as one might counsel loyal, if silent servants. So when his prize carp, usually models of aquatic decorum, began swimming erratically, bumping into each other, and generally behaving with an uncommon jolliness, after a particularly boisterous village festival, Lord Humphrey assumed the worst. The villagers, he claimed, had poured ale into his pond. And not just any ale, mind you, his ale, the fine brew meant for his own noble table. He demanded an immediate inquiry, his aristocratic indignation boiling over. The local reeve, a man accustomed to dealing with disputes over stray livestock or boundary lines, arrived, poked at the seemingly tipsy fish with a stick, and dutifully reported back that they did, in fact, appear uncommonly jolly. That was enough. Lord Humphrey, convinced of a malicious act, declared it an act of sabotage and summoned the village elders for immediate questioning. Their defence, delivered with a mix of genuine confusion and drunken sheepishness, was simple. "We were drunk, my lord, not the fish!" Naturally, that didn't fly with a nobleman convinced his carp had been wantonly inebriated. The nobleman, demonstrating the peculiar legal avenues available to the gentry, ordered a court proceeding. The outcome, as expected when a lord accused his peasants, found the villagers guilty of the willful inebriation of aquatic life. The punishment was multi-faceted, a hefty fine for the peasants, the draining of the pond, a symbolic cleansing, perhaps, of the ale-tainted water, and, because medieval justice loved paperwork and precedent, the creation of a brand new ordinance. It read, with solemn legal gravity, "Let no man or woman pour ale, wine, or spirituous drink into waters wherein swim the creatures of the Lord," and thus was born the Law of Drunken Fish. It sounds like an elaborate joke, a tale spun in a tavern after a few too many flagons, but the regulation actually spread. Neighbouring estates, perhaps fearing their own lords might bother Parliament with carp-related emergencies, adopted similar rules. It eventually became shorthand for "don't waste alcohol on animals," which, to be fair, is probably good advice even today. The best part of this aquatic saga, a detail uncovered by a later chronicler, was that the fish were perfectly fine. They'd simply been sluggish from the unusual summer heat, meaning an entire, legally binding law was based on a misinterpretation of fish behaviour. In the end, the villagers paid their fine, the pond was refilled, and Lord Humphrey continued to refer to his carp as noble creatures of refined taste, perhaps occasionally wondering if their taste was now too refined. And that's how one hot summer day, one confused nobleman, and a pond full of sluggish fish gave medieval England its first recorded animal sobriety law. Because even fish, apparently, had to know their limits. In the medieval world, church bells were sacred instruments, the very voice of God in the earthly realm. They marked births and deaths, warned of approaching storms, called the faithful to prayer, and occasionally, when a blacksmith sneezed too loud, they still managed to be a significant part of the sonic landscape. But in one unlucky French town, a bell's greatest sin wasn't ringing too often, or too loudly. It was, quite literally, trying to escape. The year was 1324, and the town of Autun, nestled in the heart of Burgundy, had just commissioned a massive bronze bell for its new church tower. It was a masterpiece of the bell, found as art, beautiful, immensely heavy, and absurdly over-decorated with intricate carvings of saints and biblical scenes. The kind of bell that screamed, "Our parish has money, and we want everyone to know it." On the day of its grand unveiling, the entire town turned out. The folk gathered in the church square, their faces upturned in awe as priests blessed it with holy water and incense. Nobles nodded approvingly, children stared in wide-eyed wonder, and merchants rubbed their hands together, already anticipating the boost to local trade from this new landmark. Then came the test ring, a moment of anticipation. A few minutes later, disaster struck. A storm, violent and unexpected, rolled in from nowhere. Thunder roared, shaking the very foundations of the church, and a bolt of lightning, seemingly guided by divine displeasure, hit the tower directly. The massive bell, loosened from its beam by the colossal impact, broke free from its moorings. It crashed through the wooden floor of the belfry with a deafening roar, then rolled down the church steps like a divine, runaway bowling ball. Witnesses, still reeling from the shock, swore it moved with purpose, crushing barrels of apples, scattering chickens in a flurry of feathers, and utterly annihilating at least one unlucky bench before finally lodging itself, with a final, aggrieved clank, in a fruit cart outside the church door. When the dust settled, and the last echoes of the thunder faded, the mayor, a man of profound solemnity, declared quite seriously that the bell had fled from its sacred duty, which, of course, meant one thing in bureaucratic medieval France: a law had to be made. The town council, convened in emergency session, issued a decree of astonishing specificity. All church bells shall henceforth be bound with chains or cords to prevent ungodly flight. And thus, with a stroke of a quill and a great deal of head shaking, was born the law of runaway bells. Local blacksmiths, perhaps still nursing a healthy fear of celestial wrath, got to work bolting every bell in town to its belfry. Priests held special blessings to ensure no more bell rebellion, sprinkling holy water and chanting incantations of spiritual tethering. Meanwhile, townspeople whispered that the rogue bell had been possessed, a divine sign of displeasure with the mayor's increasingly onerous taxes. Ironically, this new bell restraint trend, born of a single freak accident, spread across France. By the late 14th century, some cathedrals, taking the decree to extreme lengths, even chained their bells so tightly they could barely ring, leading to complaints that God might not be hearing them properly. Decades later, travellers still told the tale of the Autun bell that tried to escape judgment, a peculiar cautionary legend. It was a reminder that in the Middle Ages, even inanimate objects could be blamed for misbehaviour, their actions interpreted through a lens of divine will and earthly law. And somewhere in a dusty archive, a parchment scroll, perhaps still bearing a faint ink stain, holds that law recorded, proof that once upon a time, France legally outlawed runaway church bells. Because in medieval logic, even metal, it seemed, needed supervision. You'd think medieval priests would have been too busy saving souls and deciphering Latin texts to swing swords. You'd be wrong. Sometime in the late 12th century, in the sun-baked, turbulent kingdom of Castile, a robust and perhaps overly zealous priest named Father Rodrigo Devar found himself embroiled in a heated theological debate with a knight. The topic, rather provocatively, was whether Saint Michael, the archangel of war, could defeat a mortal warrior in single combat. It started, as many such things do, as harmless pub theology, the kind of spirited discussion one might expect after 5 pints of monastery ale, enjoyed in a smoky tavern. But pride was the most valuable currency of the Middle Ages, and neither man, fueled by ale and ego, could back down. The knight, growing increasingly frustrated with the priest's stubborn arguments, called Rodrigo a coward in cloth. Rodrigo, his face flushed with righteous indignation and perhaps a touch of the ale, replied with a dramatic flourish, "May God strike you down! Or, failing that, I shall." The next morning, to the astonishment and morbid delight of the local populace, both men showed up in a dusty field outside town. One was clad in gleaming armour, astride a powerful destrier lance at the ready. The other, Father Rodrigo, stood in his ecclesiastical robes, clutching a sword that still had candle wax clinging to its hilt, clearly a ceremonial blade that had never seen proper combat. Witnesses claimed Rodrigo actually opened the duel by solemnly blessing himself and his opponent, which might be history's most confident and certainly most unusual flex. Against all odds, in a moment of sheer improbable luck, he managed to disarm the knight with a wild flailing swing. The crowd, witnessing such a bizarre spectacle, erupted in cheers, utterly captivated by the improbable victory of piety over prowess. The church, however, did not. When word reached the local bishop, a man undoubtedly more concerned with decorum than divine intervention in duels, he nearly had a stroke. A priest defeating a knight in trial by combat was unthinkable. Not necessarily because it was sinful after all. God's will had apparently been expressed, but because it was utterly embarrassing. The bishop feared it would set a disastrous precedent. Clergy settling arguments through the sword rather than the spirit, turning every theological disagreement into a potential bloodbath. Within a week, a council convened in Toledo, and the ruling was clear, concise, and utterly definitive. No servant of God shall henceforth bear arms nor engage in duel, tourney, or violent sport. And thus, the clergy combat ban was born, the medieval church's version of HR saying, "Please, for the love of God, stop fighting your co-workers." Of course, enforcement was spotty at best. Some warrior monks, like the fiercely independent Templars, probably laughed while polishing their swords, ignoring it entirely as they were essentially soldiers first, monks second. But ordinary priests across Castile and beyond got the message. The next time someone called them cowards, they simply muttered under their breath, "I'd smite you, but canon law strictly forbids it." Still, the story of Father Rodrigo spread far and wide, becoming part cautionary tale, part inspiring legend. Some say his sword was confiscated and reforged into a crucifix, a symbol of his forced spiritual redirection. Others claim he was quietly promoted for his unorthodox defense of the faith, a testament to God's mysterious ways. Either way, one drunken duel forever separated the clergy from the chivalry, proving that sometimes holiness and hand-to-hand combat just don't mix. Of all the strange laws the Middle Ages produced, few are as gloriously petty as the one that banned whistling. It happened in the 13th century Germany, in a quiet little town along the Rhine, a place where the biggest excitement most days was watching grain dry in the sun. Then came Hans the Shepherd, a man whose lungs were like bagpipes and whose whistle could summon demons, or at the very least, annoy everyone within a mile. Hans was famous for it. He could whistle entire hymns with intricate precision, mimic the complex songs of various birds, or reproduce what he proudly called the tune of the wind, a meandering, free-form melody that seemed to have no beginning or end. The problem, however, was that his prodigious talent didn't stop at daylight. He whistled in the morning as he led his flock, at dinner as he ate his meagre meal, during Mass, often causing the choir to stumble, and worst of all, at night, his incessant melodies piercing the precious silence of the slumbering town. One evening, as the legend goes, his particularly vigorous nocturnal whistling startled a noblewoman's horses just as her carriage was crossing the town bridge. The panicked animals bolted, rearing and whinnying, sending the carriage careening into the icy river below. She survived, drenched, furious, and swearing vengeance with every spluttering breath. Within days, a solemn town council convened, its members looking grim, faced and utterly fed up. The agenda: the disturbance of the peace by oral means. The verdict was swift, decisive, and very German in its bureaucratic precision. No man, woman, or child shall whistle in public after the toll of the evening bell. And so, with a weary sigh heard throughout the town, began the law of forbidden whistles. Hans was devastated. He tried to argue that his music soothed the sheep, pleased the Lord, and brought joy to his own lonely heart. But nobody cared. The noblewoman still smelled faintly of swamp water, and the mayor's patience was long gone. When Hans was inevitably caught whistling again a week later, perhaps out of habit or sheer defiance, he was fined 3 loaves of bread and a flagon of ale, the medieval equivalent of a parking ticket, but far more impactful to a poor shepherd. Ironically, this law, born of a singular incident of annoyance, spread faster than the tune that caused it. Other towns adopted it, citing noise pollution and moral disturbance, as if a whistle could tempt one into sin. Some even claimed that night whistling attracted witches, or, worse, tax collectors. By the 15th century, entire German provinces had outlawed nighttime whistling altogether. The funniest part, a detail historians unearthed in a later town ledger, was a melancholic note stating, "The silence is unbearable. The sheep now cry at night." And so, with a peculiar concession to livestock distress, they repealed it, at least partially. In short, one man's melodic obsession turned into 2 centuries of legally enforced quiet hours. because in medieval Europe, even joy apparently required a curfew. There are many reasons laws exist to preserve order, to prevent chaos, or in this particular case, to stop one man from sanding wood in the nude. The story comes from 15th century Prague, a city famous for its soaring cathedrals, its esteemed scholars, and apparently its very confident carpenters. During a particularly sweltering summer, one diligent craftsman named Marek the Builder was engaged in the arduous task of repairing a section of the city wall. The sun beat down brutally, the air was thick and humid, and Marek, deciding that modesty was an optional accessory in such conditions, stripped off everything but his sturdy work boots. He continued hammering away, a vision of industrious unclothedness, like Adam with a hammer, utterly oblivious to the growing crowd. By mid-morning, the spectacle had drawn quite an audience. Unfortunately, that audience included a royal procession, led by none other than Queen Barbara of Scilly, passing through the city gate. Accounts differ on what shocked Her Majesty more, the sheer audacity of the nudity, or the unbridled enthusiasm with which Marek waved his mullet in greeting. By evening, word had spread across Prague like wildfire. A naked man laboured before the Queen. It sounded poetic, even romantic, in the retelling. It was not. The city council convened immediately, a whirlwind of flustered officials and red-faced aldermen. There were lengthy, impassioned discussions about morality, public decency, the sanctity of royal observation, and the grave dangers of distracting royalty with unsolicited anatomy. The verdict was unanimous: anything had to be done. Thus the council, with a mix of bureaucratic zeal and genuine horror, introduced the Naked Carpenter Ordinance, a law declaring that no man or artisan shall ply his trade unclothed within sight of Her Majesty or the public square. Marek was fined a considerable sum, publicly lectured on the merits of trousers, and reportedly muttered, as he adjusted his new, legally mandated tunic, "Then perhaps the wall shall fall again." To prevent any future offences, guild masters across the city swiftly added a clause to their codes, requiring appropriate attire during labour. And just like that, one sweaty, uninhibited carpenter gave birth to medieval Europe's first recorded workplace dress code. The story, infused with just the right blend of scandal and absurdity, spread faster than Marek's tan lines. Other towns, fearing similar royal embarrassments, followed suit, enacting their own modesty laws. One chronicler even joked that Prague's men now dressed for work as if attending church, thanks to one man's devotion to comfort. Centuries later, the ordinance technically remained on the books, a curious, often read relic in the archives. It served as an eternal warning that in medieval bureaucracy, embarrassment was not merely a social foxpass, it was a legislative event. And so, from that day on, every craftsman in Prague worked fully clothed. Not necessarily because it was practical, but because one man simply couldn't keep his hammer to himself. Of all the crimes committed in medieval Europe, few were as controversial or as utterly surreal as the one that landed a chicken in court. The year was 1474, and the setting was the prosperous Swiss city of Basel, a place where people took law, order, and poultry, it seems, very seriously indeed. One crisp morning, a farmer, his face a mask of bewilderment and fear, reported a most unnatural phenomenon. His rooster, his male bird, had laid an egg. This, strictly speaking, was not possible. Roosters, by their very biological nature, do not lay eggs, but rather than celebrating this as a miracle of unprecedented avian biology, or even just dismissing it as a peculiar malformation, the townsfolk of Basel reacted with their usual calm restraint, which is to say, they reacted with unrestrained panic. They accused the unfortunate bird of witchcraft. The news spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered outside the church, murmuring in terrified fascination, debating whether the egg was the work of the devil himself, a blasphemous sign of infernal intrusion. A few brave, rational souls suggested it was just a malformed yolk, a physiological anomaly. But the whispers of demons breeding poultry, of satanic pacts forged with fowl, quickly drowned out such sensible explanations. Eventually someone, perhaps a magistrate eager to assert legal authority over even the supernatural, decided the only solution was a formal trial. So, the rooster was formally arrested, confined in a small wooden cage, and charged with unnatural production, a wonderfully vague accusation that covered everything from demonic possession to general avian impropriety. A public defender, a lawyer tasked with representing a clucking defendant, was appointed, which in hindsight feels optimistically absurd. The trial drew hundreds, a morbid spectacle for a populace eager for both entertainment and divine justice. The judge, a man whose face was etched with the weight of judicial responsibility, listened solemnly as witnesses swore they had seen the egg with their own eyes and that the bird, in its clucking indifference, had appeared deeply unrepentant. The defence argued, with what must have been considerable effort, that the rooster, being an animal, lacked moral agency, and therefore could not enter into a pact with the devil. The prosecution countered, with chilling conviction, that Satan worked through beasts, using innocent creatures as vessels for his dark designs. The judge, clearly regretting his career choices, and perhaps questioning the sanity of his entire city, nodded, deliberated, and then, with profound gravity, declared the rooster guilty. The sentence death by fire, the same grim fate reserved for human witches. On execution day, the people of Beisel gathered in the town square. A pyre, carefully constructed of wood and straw, was built. The rooster, still in its cage, was placed atop it, and the cursed egg, the source of all the commotion, was burned alongside it. Chroniclers of the time note that many cheered, others prayed, and at least one opportunistic merchant sold roasted nuts nearby, proving that capitalism never misses an opportunity. Even at a witchcraft execution, after the incident, Basel's city council, perhaps to prevent a future influx of infernal poultry, passed a new ordinance. No citizen shall bring forth claims of infernal poultry without clerical witness. In short, you could still accuse your chicken of witchcraft, but only if a priest signed off on it first. Bureaucracy, even in the face of demonic poultry, triumphed once again. Historians later discovered, through more scientific inquiry, that the egg was probably an undeveloped mass of tissue, a biological anomaly, not witchcraft. But by then, the legend had taken root, becoming part of Basel's peculiar heritage, and so Basel became the proud home of the world's only known rooster convicted of witchcraft. A reminder that medieval justice, in its boundless application, always gave everyone their day in court, even breakfast. In a world that feared witches, ghosts, and improperly cooked stew, it was only a matter of time before someone accused footwear of supernatural activity. The story begins in 14th century Florence, a city of unparalleled art, soaring ambition, and apparently haunted shoes. A local cobbler named Giovanni Desi was renowned throughout the city for his exquisite craftsmanship. His boots were sturdy enough for a knight, his slippers elegant enough for a duchess, and his gossip, it was said, was utterly unmatched. One crisp evening, a nobleman, his face pale with a mix of fear and indignation, stormed into Giovanni's shop, making a most astonishing claim. A pair of new boots he'd purchased the week before had, he swore, walked on their own. Naturally, Giovanni, a man of practical sense and considerable skepticism, laughed aloud.
Such absurdities!
Until, that is, the nobleman produced witnesses. 3 of his most trusted servants, trembling with genuine terror, swore they had seen the boots march across the polished floor of the nobleman's study, unaided, in the middle of the night. One servant even claimed they clicked rhythmically, as though dancing to invisible, infernal music. Within days, the entire neighbourhood was convinced the devil had, inexplicably, taken up cobbling. People began frantically inspecting their own shoes for any sign of possession, fearing that their own sensible footwear might at any moment begin a demonic jig. Giovanni's once booming business, built on years of honest craftsmanship, collapsed overnight, tainted by the whispers of the supernatural. To prove his innocence, and to reclaim his livelihood, he called for an official investigation, because nothing, he believed, clears your name quite like a medieval trial about haunted footwear. The city magistrates, themselves unnerved by the pervasive rumours, took the matter with astonishing seriousness. They summoned theologians to debate the nature of demonic influence on inanimate objects, blacksmiths to inspect for hidden mechanisms, and even a tailor, just in case the walking was due to some unseen thread or trickery. After much earnest debate, grave deliberation, and probably more than a few nervous glances at their own feet, the council ruled that no proof of demonic activity could be found. The boots were merely, well, boots. But to prevent any future supernatural shoemaking, and to soothe the anxious populace, they drafted a new regulation: no craftsman shall enchant, curse, or otherwise imbue apparel with motion unnatural to its purpose. And thus, with a flourish of officialdom, the law of haunted shoes was born. Giovanni was absolved, his name cleared, though not without a lingering irony. His name, instead of being associated with fine leather, became a kind of joke. Rossi's dancing boots entered Florentine slang as a term for things that caused trouble without reason, a legacy he likely never desired. Meanwhile, the nobleman's servants, after weeks of interrogation and perhaps a few threats, eventually admitted the truth. One had moved the boots as a prank, a moment of childish mischief, and the others, enjoying the nobleman's terror, had enthusiastically joined in for fun. By the time they confessed, however, the law was already carved into the city's meticulously kept records. Centuries later, scholars, poring over dusty archives, stumbled upon the decree, sandwiched between prohibitions on noisy fountains and restrictions on overly scented candles. It's a whimsical yet profound reminder that, in medieval Florence, reality was often optional, but legislation was eternal. Because when superstition met government, even your shoes could end up on trial. If you've ever wondered how bureaucracy could possibly interfere with divine intervention, allow me to introduce you to the Church of the Middle Ages, where even miracles, it seems, required paperwork. The story unfolds in 14th century France, in a small, unremarkable village nestled near Limoges. A devout farmer named Etienne Dubois returned from Mass one morning, his face aglow with a mixture of awe and bewilderment, claiming that his cow, yes, his cow, had begun weeping during the sermon. Real, glistening tears, he swore, had streamed down its bovine face, a profound expression of sorrow and spiritual understanding. He was utterly convinced it was a sign from God, a direct message of compassion and repentance sent through his humble livestock. His neighbours, equally pious and perhaps a little susceptible to dramatic interpretations, readily agreed. The local priest, however, a man of more cautious temperament, and perhaps a touch of professional jealousy, did not. Within days, pilgrims, drawn by the incredible tale of the lachrymose cow, flooded the quiet village. Merchants, ever quick to capitalize on spiritual fervor, set up stalls hawking religious trinkets and, with impressive speed, holy milk in clay jars claiming it possessed miraculous properties. The priest, his pastoral duties overwhelmed by the spectacle, begged the bishop to intervene before the place turned into a theological farmer's market, fearing not just sacrilege but also utter chaos. The bishop, a man accustomed to both genuine faith and widespread superstition, arrived, skeptical but undeniably curious. He inspected the cow, prayed solemnly over it, and waited. Nothing. The cow merely chewed its cud with bovine indifference. Then, after a few awkward, silent minutes, just as the bishop was about to declare it all a peasant's fancy, the cow blinked. And from its large, soulful eye, a single, perfect tear rolled down its cheek. The crowd gasped. The bishop, however, frowned. This, he declared with a grim determination, requires verification, and thus a tribunal was swiftly convened, not for a sin, but for a miracle. After 3 days of painstaking investigation, which included lengthy interviews with the cow's owner, the local cheesemaker, who vouched for the cow's previously normal milk production, and one deeply confused veterinarian, who could find no physical ailment, the church concluded that while the event was impressive, it lacked sufficient spiritual merit to be considered truly divine. To prevent future bovine blasphemy and to rein in the surge of unsanctioned holiness, the diocese issued an official decree. Let no miracle be proclaimed without episcopal examination, lest false wonders lead the faithful astray. And so, the Law of Unapproved Miracles was born. Overnight, spontaneous holiness became a regulated industry. Anyone claiming to have witnessed a miracle, be it a bleeding statue, glowing bread, or an unusually polite sheep, now had to file for official approval. Unsanctioned wonder-working was punishable by fine, public penance, or worst of all, an avalanche of paperwork. Of course, genuine miracles, or what people perceived as such, didn't stop. They just got quieter. Peasants whispered about glowing crucifixes in secret and prayed their saints wouldn't do anything too noticeable lest they attract the attention of the ecclesiastical bureaucracy. As for Etiene's cow, she was declared blessed but not miraculous, and lived out her days in peaceful, or perhaps mild, confusion, and that's how medieval France managed to invent religious quality control, making sure that even heaven, it seemed, followed proper protocol, because in the Middle Ages nothing was truly sacred except procedure. If there's one thing the medieval nobility loved more than war and wine, it was fashion. Specifically, fashion that made absolutely no practical sense whatsoever. The trend began in 15th century France, a time of grand gestures and flamboyant displays, when nobles started wearing shoes with absurdly long, pointed toes, known as polines or krakows. At first they were merely stylish, adding a certain elongated elegance to the foot, long, narrow, and mildly impractical. But like all fashion trends, especially among the aristocracy, someone inevitably had to take it too far. By the 1460s, the elite were strutting around with shoes so unbelievably long that they had to literally tie the tips to their knees with ribbons just to walk straight without tripping. One chronicler, with a wry sense of humour, noted that some noblemen's polonaise were, as long as their dignity was short. Another, perhaps even more caustically, claimed you could tell a man's rank by how far his shoes stuck out, which meant social climbing became a dangerously literal endeavour. Then came the incident during a grand, solemn mass in Paris. A duke, whose name is possibly Jean de Bourbon, though historians still disagree on the exact identity of the unfortunate noble, knelt for prayer. His polonaise, extended far beyond his feet, became entangled. He tripped over his own shoes, crashed face first into a towering candlestand, setting part of his flowing, silken robe on fire and nearly immolating a bewildered bishop. The congregation panicked, the choir screamed in terror, and the duke, scrambling to his feet in a frantic attempt to extinguish himself, promptly tripped again, this time sending a spray of holy water across the altar. It was a scene straight out of slapstick comedy, except everyone involved wore titles and smelled faintly of incense. The king, upon hearing the scandalous story, was decidedly not amused. He summoned his bewildered advisers and, in an act of pure royal pragmatism, declared that fashion must never again endanger the sacred sanctity of the church. And so Parliament, acting with uncharacteristic speed, passed the toe-length law. The decree was simple, direct, and surprisingly specific. No man shall wear shoes with points exceeding 2 inches beyond the foot upon pain of fine or public ridicule. The nobility was outraged, their sartorial freedoms curtailed. The shoemakers' guild despaired, fearing the loss of their most lucrative designs. Peasants, meanwhile, cheered, though mostly because it gave them something delightful to gossip about while ankle-deep in mud. Naturally, some nobles rebelled. They cut their shoes at the allowed limit, but then defiantly stuffed the toes with wire or hardened leather to secretly extend them back to their preferred, impractical length. Others held clandestine, long shoe gatherings, flaunting their forbidden footwear by candlelight like smug heretics of fashion. But the king's decree, enforced by surprisingly vigilant fashion police, held. Within a decade, the ridiculous points vanished from court life, replaced by more sensible, if less dramatic, footwear. It's said that one anonymous poet summed it up perfectly in a widely circulated verse. Once men's toes reached heaven, now their sense does. And thus, one duke's clumsy, self-combusting moment brought reason, and mercifully shorter shoes, back to France, a testament to the unpredictable catalysts of medieval legislation. The Middle Ages were a time of profound faith, startling invention, and a complete disregard for the fundamental principles of physics. So, it was only a matter of time before a monk, gazing at the birds and pondering the mysteries of creation, decided that if angels could fly, he probably could too. The man's name was Aylmer of Malmesbury, a Benedictine monk from the 11th century England. He was known for his intelligence, his boundless curiosity, and, as events would dramatically prove, his very limited sense of self-preservation. Fascinated by birds and scriptures alike, Aylmer became utterly convinced that human flight was possible, not metaphorically, in the spiritual sense, but literally in the physical sense. According to chroniclers, whose accounts drip with a mixture of awe and bewilderment, he meticulously studied the wings of eagles, observed the intricate patterns of the wind, and eventually, after years of secretive toil, built his own prototype glider. It was a contraption of wood, cloth, and, crucially, an immense quantity of divine optimism. He confided in his fellow monks, telling them he was seeking to understand God's creation through his aerial experiments. They probably nodded politely, assuming it was a profound spiritual metaphor. It was not. On a bright, clear day around the year 1010, Aylmer, with the same conviction that led saints to martyrdom, climbed to the very top of Malmesbury Abbey. With his handmade wings strapped firmly to his arms and legs, he paused for a moment, perhaps offering a silent prayer, and then, with a leap of faith and considerable hubris, he launched himself into the air. For a few glorious, impossible seconds, it worked. He soared, however briefly, above the abbey courtyard, the wind rushing through his habit, the monks below shouting either prayers of terrified intercession or expletives of sheer astonishment. Historians aren't quite sure which. But then, as with all medieval engineering projects that defied the laws of nature, gravity made its inevitable, unyielding comeback. Aylmer crashed spectacularly, not into the ground, but into a conveniently located dung heap, breaking both his legs, but miraculously somehow surviving the ordeal. As he was carried off, bruised but unbowed, he reportedly muttered, with the hindsight of an early aeronautical engineer, "I should have made a tail." The church, understandably, was less amused. They declared his experiment reckless, dangerous, and bordering on outright hubris, a direct challenge to God's ordained order of things. The abbot, mortified by the scandal and the potential for copycat aerial attempts, swiftly convened a council and issued a new, unambiguous rule: let no man of the cloth attempt to fly under threat of penance or expulsion. And thus the ban on flying monks was born. From that day onward, monks were officially grounded, both literally and spiritually. Aylmer, undeterred by his broken legs and the church's decree, spent the rest of his life predicting the return of Halley's comet, proving that even after nearly killing himself, he was still centuries ahead of everyone else in his scientific curiosity. Ironically, his banned flight is now considered one of the earliest recorded attempts at human aviation, meaning a medieval monk technically beat Leonardo da Vinci to the skies by 500 years. But the church, having seen enough flying men for 1 millennium, remained unimpressed. And so, the age of airborne monks ended, not with a prayerful ascent, but with a very undignified landing. Power in the Middle Ages was a delicate, insidious thing, an illusion built on shifting alliances, forced smiles, and deadly secrets. Kings ruled by the sword, but those who truly survived, those who truly prospered, learned to kill without ever unsheathing it. Poison became the invisible hand that shaped dynasties, the whispered alternative to open rebellion. It was cleaner than battlefield bloodshed, quieter than daggers in the dark, and infinitely more terrifying for its elusive nature. A single, carefully administered drop of toxin could decide the fate of a kingdom before the first blade was ever drawn, leaving only a trail of rumours and suspicious illnesses. At royal banquets, danger was served subtly, alongside roasted pheasants and spiced wine. Nobles laughed and toasted with forced conviviality, but every sip was taken with a quiet, almost imperceptible hesitation. The most powerful lords and monarchs employed tasters, men or often, slaves whose only purpose in life was to die first if the food or drink was tainted. Some, incredibly, survived for years, developing an uncanny ability to detect minute changes in flavour or aroma. Others only lasted for a single, fatal night. In the great, glittering courts of Paris, Venice, and London, people didn't just fear their overt enemies, they feared their friends, their cooks, even their own wives. Poison was considered a refined art, one that belonged to those who understood subtlety, nuance, and the psychological warfare it inflicted. A sword killed the body, a blunt, obvious act. Poison, however, destroyed the soul because it replaced trust with a pervasive, corrosive paranoia. To the ambitious, the ruthless, it was the perfect weapon. It left no witnesses, only unsettling rumours of a sudden, mysterious illness. It killed kings without the messy upheaval of rebellion, silenced rivals without the inconvenience of open war, and erased inconvenient heirs without scandal, leaving a clean, if suspicious, path to power. Its omnipresent threat transformed the very etiquette of court life. The most innocent gestures, passing a goblet of wine, kissing a proffered hand, biting into a fresh piece of fruit, became fraught rituals of potential danger. Women wore perfumes discreetly laced with volatile toxins. Noblemen carried rings with hidden compartments and tiny, poisoned needles. Even rosaries, instruments of piety, were rumoured to conceal deadly dusts, ready to be flicked into a rival's drink. A courteous offer of wine could be a death sentence, a shared meal, an act of mutual, silent suspicion. Yet, poison was more than a weapon, it was a language. In an era where spoken words could be fatal, poison spoke eloquently in silence. A sudden, lingering illness in a duke, a queen's inexplicable pale complexion, a slow, agonizing death tragically mistaken for divine punishment. All were coded messages, warnings from those who ruled from behind the heavy velvet curtains of power. The Middle Ages were an age of faith and fear, of gleaming gold and creeping greed. And behind every jewelled goblet and glittering feast lurked a chilling question that haunted even the bravest hearts. Who will drink first? Beneath the grandeur of castles and cathedrals, another world thrived, a world of mortar pestle and profound secrecy. The apothecaries of the Middle Ages were the quiet alchemists of power, their dimly lit shops heavy with the mingled scents of healing herbs, fragrant oils, and something darker, something profoundly sinister. To the public, they were healers, respected figures preparing soothing ointments for burns, or invigorating tonics for sleepless nobles. But behind their locked doors, often under the cloak of night, they mix death with the same meticulous precision as medicine. A few grains too many of a powdered herb could silence a troublesome bishop. A single drop too few could let him live to denounce his murderer, leading to catastrophic consequences for both client and apothecary. These men and women walked a precarious, often terrifying, fine line between rudimentary science and whispered sorcery. Their shelves were lined with rows of glass jars filled with potent, often deadly, botanicals, nightshade, belladonna, hemlock, and glistening mercury. All these were perfectly legal and beneficial in the right, healing hands, but utterly damning and lethal in the wrong. Many of them were diligent students of Old Greek and Arabic texts, diligently blending the wisdom of Hippocrates with the esoteric whispers from ancient Persia and distant Egypt. They spoke in hushed tones of philosophical poisons, concoctions that killed slowly, subtly, beautifully, and most importantly, without leaving a trace that could be easily identified by an uneducated physician. Royal courts coveted their skills, feared their power, and punished them in equal measure. A truly skilled apothecary could make a prince sleep forever, sending him peacefully to his ancestors with no outward sign of foul play. Yet the same man might be burned as a heretic or accused of witchcraft if his lethal concoctions ever turned, or were perceived to turn, against the crown. Some apothecaries found a precarious safety by aligning themselves with powerful queens or influential mistresses, offering them protection in the form of tiny vials hidden in their ornate jewelry boxes, ready for a moment of desperate necessity. Others lived out their lives in exile, their dangerous knowledge too potent to be allowed to remain freely among the powerful. Their workrooms were typically dim and damp, often lit only by the flickering glow of a single candle. Pestles, ground powders of crushed pearls, powdered snake venom, and minute amounts of arsenic into lethal dusts, each step measured with meticulous care. They tested their mixtures with clinical detachment on rats, dogs, and sometimes, regrettably, on unfortunate prisoners. When the concoctions worked, when death arrived discreetly and effectively, they often gave them elegant, deceptively benign names: Aquatina, Avenomerus, or simply the blessed water. In truth, these were curses disguised as cures, carefully crafted instruments of fate. And yet, amid the pervasive death, there was a strange, dark fascination. Even kings, whose lives were constantly at risk, admired their precision and their profound understanding of the delicate balance between life and death. Apothecaries represented the very edge of human control over nature, the terrifying power to decide who would live and who would die without ever lifting a blade. To the devout, it was the gravest sin. To the ambitious, it was unadulterated genius. Every vial held a silent story, every powder a deadly secret. And when the faint scent of rosemary and sage, often used to mask more noxious odours, drifted through castle corridors, even the most faithful prayed it wasn't hiding something bitter underneath. If poison had a patron saint, it would undoubtedly have been a queen. In a world brutally ruled by men and sharpened steel, royal women, often denied overt political power, discovered that the deadliest influence came not from brute muscle, but from profound subtlety. Their most potent weapons were not swords or armies, which they could not command, but goblets, cosmetics, and whispered smiles. When marriage meant a fragile alliance, and betrayal meant the difference between survival and oblivion, the simple cup became as dangerous and powerful as the very crown itself. The great courts of Europe were sprawling, glittering stages of constant performance, where every gesture, every word, was carefully weighed. Queens learned to act beautifully, to charm and flatter, while plotting silently, brilliantly, behind eyes that held ancient secrets. In England, dark rumours claimed that Eleanor of Aquitaine's vibrant court often dined in fear, that rivals who crossed her mysteriously grew pale and sick after sharing her table. Whether true or not, the story stuck, because in the Middle Ages, belief in such power was as potent as any venom. Across the Alps, in the dazzling, treacherous courts of Italy, the Borgias perfected the art. Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of the infamous Pope Alexander VI, became a legend, her reputation so stained by rumour and dark whispers that her very name came to mean treachery wrapped in silk, beauty concealing profound danger. It was famously said that Lucrezia wore a ring with a hidden compartment under a rotating gemstone. A single, imperceptible twist could release a tiny drop of potent poison into a cup, or onto a fingertip offered in greeting, a deadly kiss. One sip, one touch, and a man might begin to cough his last confession. Whether she truly used it, whether these stories were fact or malicious fabrication, mattered little. The fear itself was power, and Lucrezia wielded it masterfully, a silent, psychological weapon. Other women, emboldened or desperate, followed her example. Queens in France and Spain learned to command their own apothecaries, demanding mixtures that could subtly soften a difficult husband's temper, or, if necessary, erase him entirely from the political landscape. Lovers, courtiers, even nuns in certain orders played this silent, deadly game where passion and poison danced a macabre, elegant tango. Love potions were often sold by the same shadowy merchants who supplied assassins, a grim duality. Many women, trapped in political marriages, pretended to seek affection when, in truth, they sought freedom, a chance to reshape their destiny. And yet, for all their cunning and secrecy, the risk was enormous. If caught, even royal blood, even the most powerful connections, could not wash away the stain of murder. A queen might trade her crown for a noose, her beauty for eternal infamy. But in a time when every alliance was fragile, when men held the sword and the throne, these extraordinary women found their rebellion, their power, in the shimmering depths of a jeweled cup. The art of poisoning relied profoundly on deception, on subtle manipulation of taste, texture, and most critically, timing. A deadly meal in the Middle Ages did not look suspicious, indeed, it looked delicious, tantalizingly so. Honey, glazed meats, exotic imported wines, and candied fruits from distant lands all provided the perfect, aromatic camouflage for a lethal concoction. Poison was tasteless to the careless, but a master assassin could make it an integral, indistinguishable part of the flavor profile. A generous sprinkle of cinnamon could mask the metallic tang of arsenic. A dark, rich wine could easily hide the bitterness of belladonna. And thick, aromatic soups, brimming with herbs and spices, could carry death as easily and innocuously as salt. At royal tables, food became a highly choreographed form of theatre, fraught with unspoken tension. The kitchen, usually a bustling, boisterous place, was both a battleground and a clandestine laboratory. Cooks suspected of complicity were interrogated before every banquet. Tasked as those condemned souls, were summoned like priests officiating a grim ritual, and the first bite of every dish, the first sip of every goblet, was an act of profound, terrifying courage. Some courts, gripped by paranoia, even introduced elaborate rituals of reassurance. The host would famously eat from every dish first, or trusted servants would perform mock tastings to publicly display their unwavering loyalty. Still, people died. And when they did, the symptoms, the violent vomiting, the sudden seizures, the burning fevers, the wild delirium, were often blamed on divine punishment, on bad humours, or on a simple, unfortunate illness. Few truly understood the nascent science of poison. Even fewer dared to openly question such diagnoses, lest they too fall under suspicion. The poisoners, however, understood everything. They knew that timing mattered more than the precise dose. Administering the poison too quickly, leading to an immediate, dramatic death, instantly raised suspicion. Too slowly, and the target might flee, or even worse, miraculously recover. The ideal poisoner aimed for an exquisite elegance death, after a day or two, just enough time for rumours to grow, for enemies to make mistakes, and for the assassin to be far from the scene. Chronic poisons were especially admired for their insidious nature. Mercury antimony, or lead, administered in minute, regular doses, could mimic a lingering illness for weeks, before finally killing cleanly, subtly. These slow, agonizing deaths fooled even the most learned physicians, who often, tragically, prescribed more of the very medicine that was slowly killing their patient. One of the most notorious examples was aqua tofana, a colourless, tasteless concoction made of arsenic, lead, and belladonna. It was sold primarily to noblewomen in small, seemingly innocuous vials disguised as holy water from St. Nicholas's Church in Naples. A few drops, imperceptibly added to a difficult husband's soup over several days, and the wife would soon be a grieving, perfectly innocent widow, free from her bonds. Authorities eventually caught its maker, the infamous Julia Tofina, but not before hundreds, perhaps thousands, had died, their deaths attributed to mysterious ailments. And yet the fascination endured. To poison in the Middle Ages was to manipulate fate itself, to play God with a spoon and a whispered smile. Every banquet was a gamble, every toast a silent prayer. And as the candles burned low, and the golden goblets clinked, death waited patiently, elegantly, among the silverware. By the late Middle Ages, poison had become so refined, so integral to the fabric of power, that its trade demanded organization. Not every killer used a blade. Some wore humble robes, counted prayer beads, and pretended to serve God, hidden beneath monasteries, within the labyrinthine passages of apothecaries, and even in the echoing crypts of cathedrals. Secret networks of poisoners began to emerge. These were men and women who sold silence in bottles, death in powdered form. These were the guilds that no king dared to openly acknowledge. Though many quietly relied on their services, the line between saint and sinner, between healer and murderer, blurred irrevocably within their shadowy ranks. Many of these sophisticated poisoners began as respected physicians or learned herbalists, trained in the vast monastic libraries where knowledge of plants and compounds was considered divine wisdom. They learned how to heal fevers, how to soothe grievous wounds, and, with the same meticulous care, how to reverse the process entirely. A tincture of monkshood could purify a body. A precisely measured dose of belladonna could send a soul to its final judgment. Some took holy vows by day and mixed venoms by night, believing themselves instruments of divine justice, rather than mere murderers, enacting God's will with a carefully administered drop. Church authorities knew, of course. They always knew. But as long as the death served holy purposes, extinguishing a troublesome heretic, removing a political rival, or silencing an inconvenient noble, eyes were conveniently, religiously closed. The papal courts of Rome, the powerful bishops of France, even the terrifying inquisitors themselves, sometimes discreetly sought out these holy apothecaries. A pope, constrained by his holy office, could not openly draw a sword, but he could certainly bless a vial. And when heretics, rivals, or inconvenient nobles fell suddenly sick after a papal feast, no one, absolutely no one, dared to speak of poison. It was simply God's will, a convenient alignment with papal politics. These secret guilds communicated through coded prayers and symbolic gestures. A sprig of wolfsbane carved into a wooden door might mark a safe house. Letters were written in seemingly innocuous recipes. Add 2 parts of trust, 1 of forgiveness, might secretly mean 2 drops at supper, 1 at confession. Even the confessional booth, a place of spiritual purification, became a place of negotiation, where guilt and payment for future services were both whispered in equal, hushed measure. But the Church's protective shadow was not eternal. In time, scandals inevitably broke through. Bodies of cardinals and courtiers began piling up faster than grace could possibly explain. Trials were held, always in secret, always with suspiciously missing witnesses. Some poisoners vanished into remote abbeys, their fates unknown. Others, like the infamous nun of Hildehem, were buried alive within cloister walls to preserve their deadly silence and the dangerous secrets they held. Still, the knowledge survived, whispered from master to apprentice, because poison, unlike a sword, could not be confiscated. It lived in the mind, carried in prayers, hidden in the very rituals of faith. And as the church bells tolled over Europe's great cities, those who truly understood their meaning smiled, knowing that death still knelt, quietly, at the altar. Among the most tragic figures of medieval courts was the food taster, the designated human shield positioned between monarch and poison. Their duty was brutally simple: to eat, to drink, and quite possibly to die, so their master might live. They were called gustatores in Latin, meaning literally tasters, though in truth they were closer to sacrificial lambs. Every royal banquet, every celebratory feast, began with their trembling hands. Every toast, every sip of precious wine, depended entirely on their steady heartbeat, on their body's capacity to absorb a sudden, agonizing death. Some were slaves, forced into the role, their lives utterly expendable. Others were volunteers, rewarded with coin or powerful favor, their desperate ambition outweighing their fear of oblivion. But all shared the same grim fate: an existence spent 1 bite, 1 sip, away from agonizing death. The position demanded more than mere courage. It required an encyclopedic knowledge of poisons and their subtle manifestations. A skilled taster learned to detect the slightest bitterness, the faint metallic notes that signaled the presence of arsenic or mercury. They observed the very colour of the wine, the subtle smell of a stew, even the way steam rose or failed to rise from a suspected cup. But poisons, ever evolving, were often more cunning than their instincts. Some were utterly odourless, others delayed their lethal effects for hours or even days. Many a taster declared a dish safe, only to die hours later, often alongside their unsuspecting employer. Tasters lived in a state of constant, corrosive anxiety, their nerves frayed by their routine proximity to death. Some resorted to strange, Desperate rituals wearing charms of blessed herbs, reciting silent prayers before each meal, or even, in a gruesome act of self-preservation, cutting themselves slightly before eating, believing the poison would somehow bleed out before taking full effect. A few became half-alchemists themselves, secretly drinking diluted poisons over time to build up a degree of resistance. An early, crude form of immunity that sometimes worked, but more often led to a slow, painful deterioration of their own bodies. Despite their grim purpose, jousters were often treated as trusted confidants. Kings, surrounded by enemies and sycophants, often trusted their jousters more than their own physicians, for their loyalty was proven daily, in the most visceral way imaginable. Queens wept openly when their jousters died, even if the tears were as much political as they were genuine. Some monarchs, paranoid beyond reason, employed multiple jousters, each testing the food in succession, their faces watched like omens. If one grimaced, if one faltered in their composure, the entire meal was instantly discarded, a priceless feast cast aside. There are tales of loyalty that bordered on madness. One taster in the court of Hungary allegedly leapt forward to drink from a poisoned chalice meant for the queen, collapsing moments later with blackened lips. His bravery became legend, his name tragically forgotten. In a world where friendship was often an illusion and trust a fatal liability, such men embodied both profound faith and ultimate futility. For every toast raised in golden halls, there was a silent prayer murmured by a trembling servant, "Let this taste be clean. Let this breath be mine to keep." In the Middle Ages, politics was not a genteel game of speeches and diplomatic niceties, it was a ruthless chessboard soaked in venom. Assassination by blade was crude, messy, and left undeniable evidence. Poison, on the other hand, was the weapon of thinkers, of the strategically brilliant and the profoundly ruthless. It required patience, meticulous planning, and, most chillingly, the ability to smile genuinely at your victim while subtly sealing their fate. Behind every coronation, every strategic marriage, every meticulously drafted treaty, there was always the terrifying possibility that a single, unnoticed sip of wine could rewrite history, erasing rivals and elevating allies in silence. The vibrant Italian city-states, Florence, Milan, and Venice, became veritable laboratories of political poisoning. Ambassadors, sent to foreign courts, often carried carefully disguised antidotes in their belts. Popes dined only with their most trusted cardinals, their plates pre-tasted. Rival families, the Medicis, the Sforzas, the Viscontis, used poison as casually as they signed contracts, an unspoken tool in their relentless quest for dominance. A sudden fever, a rapid decline in health, was rarely considered divine punishment. When diplomacy failed, a banquet invitation often followed, and within days the problem was discreetly solved. No soldiers needed, no public scandal, just a quiet funeral and a new alliance forged in the silence of death. France and England were no different in their embrace of this invisible warfare. During the protracted 100 Years' War, noblewomen, adept in the subtle arts of court intrigue, sent poisoned gloves and perfumed handkerchiefs to enemy courtiers, their seemingly innocuous gifts carrying a deadly secret. Henry Vitte's court whispered endlessly about mysterious deaths, and Anne Boleyn's rivals, it was noted, fell ill far too often to be mere coincidence. Even monks serving in royal kitchens were accused of corruption, their pious duties concealing a darker allegiance. The kitchens of kings became political minefields, every loaf of bread and every bottle of wine a possible instrument of treason. The Church, in its official capacity, tried to condemn poisoners, thundering against their unholy methods. Yet, hypocritically, it secretly benefited from them. Cardinals poisoned other cardinals. Popes blessed the convenient deaths of kings who defied them. God's will, they piously declared, but God's will conveniently aligned with papal politics and the expansion of church power. Even Crusaders, supposedly on a holy mission, carried vials of venom to dispatch Saracen leaders, claiming it was a righteous act of holy justice. Some rulers weaponized fear itself. Frederick II of Sicily, the Stupor Mundi, was rumoured to host banquets where he fed small, controlled doses of various toxins to condemned prisoners, observing their agonizing deaths with scientific detachment. His court physicians kept meticulous notes, like scholars recording an experiment. Such scientific cruelty spread across Europe, a chilling pursuit of knowledge. Kings wanted to know which poisons killed cleanly, leaving the body unmarked, which mimicked natural diseases, and which could be administered almost imperceptibly. The result was a continent ruled by a creeping, pervasive paranoia. Trust died before most rulers did. Friendship was a liability and hospitality a potential trap. In the courts of Europe, survival depended not on loyalty, but on acute observation, on knowing when to graciously refuse a drink and when to smile warmly while letting someone else sip first. As the medieval world crept toward the dazzling dawn of the Renaissance, the poisoner's craft began to merge with something grander, something more intellectually ambitious: alchemy. What began as a secret art of murder, shrouded in fear and illicit trade, evolved into the scientific pursuit of transformation, of understanding the very building blocks of the universe. Alchemists tirelessly sought the philosopher's stone, the secret to transmuting base metals into gold, to discovering immortality, and to unlocking divine knowledge. But in their fervent experiments, in their relentless quest for profound understanding, they stumbled upon the most refined, most potent, and often most insidious poisons known to humankind. They were not killers by intent, yet death was often their terrifying byproduct. Their laboratories were dim, smoke-filled sanctuaries of discovery, furnaces burning day and night, crucibles hissing ominously with bubbling mercury, glinting arsenic, and shimmering antimony. These were the very same substances used by assassins, now meticulously dressed in the language of philosophy, of esoteric knowledge. To the church, it was dangerous curiosity, bordering on heresy. To kings, however, it was opportunity. Monarchs, ever hungry for power and wealth, began to sponsor these alchemists in secret, hoping to turn their forbidden knowledge toward both immense riches and effective warfare. A philosopher's stone could grant eternal power, but a poison perfected could destroy a rival in silence, reshaping a kingdom with no messy battles. The alchemist journals read like a bizarre, fascinating blend of scripture and sin. They spoke of aqua fortis, strong water, that corroded everything it touched, of mercury, the silver serpent, and of deadly elixirs that promised purification through suffering, a paradoxical blend of healing and harm. Some even argued that poison itself was not inherently evil, but divine, an agent of natural balance, removing corruption from the world, a form of sacred chemistry. Yet alchemy's relentless obsession with purity blurred moral lines. Experiments on condemned prisoners, on desperate beggars, and on unsuspecting servants became terrifyingly common, all conducted in the name of discovery, of advancing knowledge. The promise of eternal life, they rationalized, demanded a few mortal sacrifices. It was during these centuries that Europe's understanding of toxins reached a terrifying precision. Arsenic could now be purified into a fine white powder, utterly indistinguishable from sugar. Lead could be distilled into sweet, innocuous-looking syrups that killed slowly, insidiously. Even cosmetics, used by noblewomen to enhance their beauty, sometimes contained lethal doses of mercury and vinegar. Beauty itself, in this era, became toxic. Ironically, this era of profound scientific progress, this quest for enlightenment, created more victims than ever before. The same formulas that laid the foundation for modern chemistry also ensured that death was now portable, odorless, and discreetly delivered. By the 15th century, a noble's table was not merely a place for feasting, it was a battlefield of invisible forces, faith, ambition, and nascent science, all colliding in every glass, in every morsel. Alchemy promised enlightenment, but it left behind a darker, more insidious inheritance, a Europe that had learned to kill not with swords, but with knowledge. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was exhausted, not just from centuries of relentless warfare and devastating plagues, but from the insidious creep of suspicion. Poison had permeated every corner of life, staining love, corrupting politics, and even undermining the very foundations of faith. The glittering courts of kings and queens, once centres of chivalry and ceremony, became dens of quiet fear. Every banquet was a gamble, every shared goblet a potential death trap, every friendship a potential death sentence. The old virtues, honour, loyalty, hospitality, had been systematically replaced by caution, by the desperate reliance on antidotes, and by the refined art of pretense. Trust, once the beating heart of courtly life, was now a luxury few could afford, a dangerous indulgence. Noblemen, consumed by paranoia, drank only from their own specially guarded cups, carried personal, untainted knives, and travelled with physicians uniquely skilled in the rapid administration of antidotes. Marriage, once a sacred bond of power and alliance, became a chilling contest of endurance, of survival. A queen's kiss could be fatal. A husband's toast could be the final, most intimate betrayal. Lovers met in secret, but always kept their goblets meticulously apart. The more glittering the court, the more hollow its laughter became, echoing with unspoken anxieties. Rumours thrived where concrete evidence could not. A bishop's sudden, lingering illness was whispered to be either divine punishment for a hidden sin, or more likely the ruthless ambition of a rival. A countess's pale complexion, a duchess's sudden fainting spell, these became gossip currency, traded between courtiers like poisoned coins. Everyone had a theory, intricately constructed, but no one, absolutely no one, had irrefutable proof. Poison had achieved what no army, no open rebellion, ever could: total psychological conquest. Even the apothecaries, those silent masters of the craft, began to vanish. Their art, once a whispered trade, became too dangerous to practice openly. Some fled to distant, remote provinces, taking their deadly knowledge with them, hoarding it like a priceless treasure. Others were captured, imprisoned, and tortured for secrets they steadfastly refused to give, their minds vaults of forbidden chemistry. The Inquisition, in its relentless pursuit of heresy, condemned them as servants of Satan, but secretly, hypocritically, used their recipes in interrogation chambers. Death had simply changed uniforms, from royal robe to monk's cowl. And yet, amid the pervasive paranoia, there was an odd, grudging kind of respect. Poison had become the ultimate symbol of sophistication, of intellect, and of terrifying restraint. It killed with elegance, demanded precision, and punished arrogance with a silent, agonizing efficiency. It was not the clumsy weapon of the brute, but the subtle instrument of the refined, calculating mind. As the Middle Ages faded, and the Renaissance dawned, the art of poison did not die. It merely adapted, evolving to meet new political landscapes. New poisons would emerge under new names, subtly dressed in perfume, in medicine, and in the very guise of progress. The age of knights had ended, but the age of intrigue, the age of the silent killer, had just begun. Because, as every survivor of that fraught era knew too well, true power never shouts, it whispers, quietly in a cup. They came from the edge of the world, men of ice and iron, born where the sun barely rose in winter, and the fjords carved deep scars into the land. The Vikings, those fearsome Northmen, had already carved their legend into the coastlines of Britain and Francia, their longships a terrifying harbinger of raid and conquest. But by the late 10th century, their formidable longships, sleek and swift, turned eastward, gliding through the black, churning waters of the Baltic and into the great, winding rivers of the Rus. What they sought was not new land to settle, not merely villages to plunder, but new masters to serve and new fortunes to claim, far beyond the familiar shores of the West. These were warriors shaped by an unforgiving hardship. They had grown up in frozen fjords, on windswept islands, trained since childhood to wield axe and shield with effortless, brutal efficiency. Their world was ruled by an ancient, unyielding code of honor, by blood spilled in battle, and by silver paid for service. Raiding was not just avarice, it was survival. Loyalty was a contract, sacred and binding, paid in gleaming gold and unfailing trust. So when word spread that far beyond the fledgling Rus kingdoms, beyond Kiev's nascent power, lay a city of dazzling marble and immeasurable gold, Constantinople, the legendary queen of cities, they listened. It was whispered that the Byzantine emperor himself, ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, hired northern mercenaries as his personal guard. Men who would answer to no general, no local noble, no petty intrigue, only to the sacred, gilded throne itself. The journey was long and merciless, a test of endurance and resolve. They followed the great rivers, the Dnieper and the Volga, hauling their ships overland through dense forests, battling sudden storms, hungry wolves and hostile nomadic steppe raiders who emerged from the vast plains. Many died along the arduous path before ever glimpsing the Aegean Sea or the fabled Golden Domes. But those who survived, those who endured the crucible of the eastern rivers, reached a world utterly unlike anything they had ever imagined. Where the north offered only ice and pine, stark beauty and brutal cold, Constantinople dazzled with its shimmering domes of gold, its perfumed markets, its soaring cathedrals that seemed to touch the very clouds. To the Byzantines, these Norsemen were a paradox, both terrifying in their raw savagery and immensely useful in their disciplined ferocity. They were giants in furs and leather, speaking a guttural language no Greek could comprehend, wielding massive axes that could split armor like butter. Yet beneath the savage exterior was a profound discipline, the kind forged by endless, unforgiving battle. The emperor, a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, recognized something rare and invaluable in them, a loyalty that, once pledged, could not be bought twice, a fierce, almost primal devotion. For while Byzantine generals might conspire and intrigue, the Northmen, The Varangians had one simple, unwavering rule: serve faithfully and die with honor. Thus, from the ashes of Viking raiding, from the very edges of the known world, rose something far more enduring and legendary: the Varangian Guard. They were not mere mercenaries. They became symbols of fear and devotion, foreign sentinels guarding the very heart of an empire. And in the glittering corridors of Constantinople's great palace, their axes gleamed not with blood, but with the terrifying authority of imperial power. To reach the heart of Byzantium, the Vikings had to carve a path through an entirely different empire, the vast and rugged land of the Rus. This sprawling region, stretching from the dense forests of Novgorod in the north to the wide, fertile plains of Kiev in the south, was ruled by Norsemen who had settled generations earlier. These were their kin, descendants of legendary figures like Rurik and Oleg, Vikings who had traded their longship sails for princely crowns, blending their ancient traditions with the indigenous Slavic tribes, and building nascent kingdoms along the vital river arteries. The route they controlled, the famed way from the Varangians to the Greeks, became the perilous lifeline between the cold, primeval north and the dazzling, sophisticated south. Through this vital corridor, long ships, heavily laden with furs, honey and amber, drifted past misty riverbanks and the formidable wooden fortresses that guarded strategic points. The Dnieper River, in particular, became both a crucial road and a terrifying trial. Its infamous rapids, known as the Dnieper Cataracts, were feared even by the most seasoned Norse sailors. Warriors had to literally drag their massive ships across rocks and through churning waters, all while hostile tribes, ever watchful, lurked in the dense tree line, waiting for any sign of weakness, ready to strike. A single ambush, a moment of faltering, could end an entire expedition before it ever saw profit. But the allure of Byzantine gold, of the fabled riches of the great city, outweighed any fear. And so, year after year, with grim determination, Norsemen risked the treacherous journey. At the heart of this trade route stood the burgeoning city of Kiev, ruled by the Grand Prince. It quickly became a vibrant, bustling trading hub, a crossroads where furs, slaves' honey, and amber from the north were exchanged for the silks, spices, and gleaming gold coins stamped with the emperor's face from the south. Here, Byzantine envoys, draped in rich brocades, and formidable Viking chieftains, clad in furs and iron, haggled under banners that mingled the Christian cross with the ancient hammer of Thor. Many future Varangians swore service in Kiev first, fighting for the Rus princes, sharpening their skills in countless skirmishes, before moving further south to seek the ultimate favour of the emperor. By the time they reached Constantinople, they were no longer mere raiders or raw recruits. They were seasoned veterans of the river wars, tempered by hardship, united by a singular purpose, and hungry for greater glory. The Byzantines called them a Varangoi, from the Old Norse aviti ringjar, meaning oathman, and their oaths, once sworn, were held sacred. Once pledged to the emperor, they were his unto death, their loyalty fierce and unwavering. Their arrival at the imperial court caused both profound fascination and a palpable unease. These towering foreigners, with their braided beards, their strange, guttural language, and their massive axes taller than many children, stood out starkly amid the polished marble and perfumed courtiers of the palace. Yet their formidable reputation preceded them. They had not come to beg or to bow. They had come to serve, to fight, and in doing so, to carve their unique saga into the ancient story of the Byzantine Empire. The rivers of the Rus had carried not just merchants and mercenaries, but destiny itself. When the first Varangians truly arrived in force in Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire was a sprawling, ancient entity, wary from internal betrayal and external threats. Generals plotted against emperors, palace eunuchs traded secrets, and influence like currency, and loyalty, that most precious commodity, was a rarity even among the highest-ranking nobles. The imperial throne, gilded and glorious, often sat precariously upon a bed of daggers and whispered conspiracies. Emperor Basil Su, a shrewd and ruthless ruler known to history as the Bulgar Slayer, for his brutal campaigns, understood that the survival of his empire required more than just soldiers. It required men who could not be bought, whose loyalty was absolute and unshakable. That is precisely why he turned his gaze to the rugged, distant north. In the pivotal year of 988, following the strategic conversion of Prince Vladimir of Kiev to Christianity, Basil struck a monumental deal. Vladimir, seeking a powerful alliance, sent 6,000 of his fiercest, most battle-hardened warriors to Constantinople. In exchange, Basil offered the immense prestige of an imperial marriage, vital political ties, and a considerable bounty of gold. These men, veterans of countless skirmishes, untamed by the luxuries of the south, became the formidable foundation of the Varangian Guard. From that transformative moment, they were bound by an unbreakable oath to the Emperor himself, loyal to him alone. Even above the empire they served, a unique and potent arrangement. Their pledge was sacred, sealed not by fragile parchment, but by blood, by ancient Norse tradition, and by their new Christian faith. The Varangians swore to defend the Emperor's body and his throne with their very lives, to stand unyielding against all enemies, both foreign invaders and domestic conspirators. They were deliberately kept exempt from Byzantine politics, their absolute loyalty ensured by their foreign origin, their distinct culture, and their inherent separation from the endemic intrigues of the court. They spoke little Greek, cared nothing for the petty squabbles of court factions, and followed orders with unflinching, brutal precision. In battle, their presence was unmistakable, a terrifying spectacle. They were towering figures clad in gleaming chainmail, often adorned with furs, wielding massive two-handed axes that gleamed like silver in the sun. They fought not in tight, rigid formations like the Byzantine legions, but as living storms, sweeping through enemy ranks with a ferocity and efficiency that struck terror into the hearts of their foes. To see a Varangian in motion was to witness both primal chaos and disciplined, coordinated brutality intertwined. Contemporary chroniclers, even those within the Byzantine court, described them in awe as the Emperor's thunder, men who brought swift, terrifying silence wherever rebellion dared to speak or an enemy force massed. The Byzantines admired and feared them in equal measure. They were known to drink heavily, to fight fiercely, and to demand their wages in hard, gleaming coin, not empty promises. Yet when the heavy, bronze palace gates closed, the Emperor could sleep soundly, knowing that the men standing guard outside his door were, in their own fierce way, utterly incorruptible. For centuries, that profound, unwavering trust would hold. Thus was born one of the most loyal brotherhoods in medieval history, a foreign army guarding the ancient, fragile heart of an empire. The Byzantines gave them golden glory. The Varangians gave them fearlessness, unyielding steel, and deadly silence. It was not a mere alliance, it was a covenant of survival. To the Byzantines, the Varangians were both formidable soldiers and potent symbols, living, breathing proof that the Emperor's imperial reach extended even into the frozen, mythical north. They were aptly called Peleikophoroi, meaning axe bearers, for their weapon of choice was the fearsome, great two-handed Dane axe. Forged in the brutal traditions of the Viking North, it was not a tool of finesse or delicate maneuver, but of raw power and finality. A single sweeping swing of that enormous axe could cleave through armour, bone, and shield alike, ending a life with terrifying efficiency. In the polished marble corridors of the great palace, its mere sight, the glint of steel, was often enough to silence conspirators and quash whispered plots. The Varangians stood apart from every other Byzantine regiment, distinct and intimidating. Their imposing size and fearsome ferocity made them a stark spectacle in an empire renowned for its elaborate ceremony and intricate displays. Clad in heavy chain mail and animal furs, with round shields painted in ancient Norse patterns, they towered over the diminutive court eunuchs and effete diplomats who scurried beneath the soaring domes of Hagia Sophia. Foreigners they might have been, their language and customs alien, but to the Emperor, they were purity incarnate, unmixed by Byzantine corruption, untempted by the allure of gold or the poison of flattery. Their loyalty was absolute, unyielding, but their wrath, once roused, was the stuff of legend. In battle, they were the Emperor's final, devastating word. When rebellion erupted within the capital, or when enemies breached the sacred walls, the Varangians were unleashed like a divine, unstoppable storm. They did not negotiate, they did not retreat. They simply advanced, their axes scything, their war cries chilling. Contemporary chroniclers wrote with awe and terror that their charges fell upon the foe like wolves upon a flock, their sheer, brutal force overwhelming all resistance. Even Muslim and Western armies, when facing Byzantium's might, recorded their palpable terror at the sight of these northern giants with axes like moonlight, a description that vividly captures their awesome presence. Training for such men was not gentle. New recruits, often drawn from Scandinavia, Iceland, or later, after the Norman conquest, from Anglo-Saxon England, had to prove themselves through grueling endurance. They drilled endlessly under the burning Anatolian sun, their foreign bodies adapting to the unfamiliar heat, learning Byzantine formations, shield wall techniques, and the complex protocols of palace life. Yet, they never truly lost their northern edge, the brutal efficiency of warriors raised on sagas of ice and storms. When they guarded the emperor in solemn procession, their axes glinted in the sun, a constant, potent reminder to all that divine authority had formidable muscle behind it. And when they fought in distant campaigns, in the scorching deserts of Syria, the fertile lands of Sicily, or the rugged mountains of the Balkans, they carried the empire's banner with the same devotion they had once shown to Odin or their ancient Norse gods. In their formidable hands, the Viking spirit found a new, unexpected home, not in raiding or conquest for its own sake, but in disciplined, unwavering service to the world's richest and most ancient throne. The axe of the north had, quite literally, become the shield of the east. The Varangians were not mere palace ornaments, decorative symbols of imperial might. They were warriors first, bodyguards second, and when the empire went to war, when its very existence hung in the balance, the emperor brought his northern guard to the very front lines. They were his ultimate assurance, a living, breathing guarantee that no matter what chaos erupted, his command would stand, enforced by their unyielding will. The chronicles of the 10th and 11th centuries are scattered with their ferocious deeds, their relentless charges, where their axes bit deep into the ranks of both Christian and Muslim foes, their reputation for ferocity spreading across the known world. Their true baptism of fire came during the grueling, protracted campaigns of Emperor Basil II, the formidable Bulgar Slayer. Against the fierce Bulgarians, the Varangians became instruments of relentless, unsparing vengeance. They fought through the rugged, unforgiving mountains of the Balkans, hacking their way through ambushes and storming seemingly impregnable fortresses alike. The Bulgarians, witnessing their tireless, merciless, and seemingly unstoppable advance, called them blue-eyed demons, a testament to their chilling effectiveness. When Basil finally defeated the Bulgarians, in a moment of infamous brutality, and blinded thousands of prisoners, the Varangians formed an impenetrable wall around him, their faces as cold and impassive as their distant homeland. They did not question his cruelty, they simply enforced it with unwavering discipline. Over the following decades, they marched with Byzantine armies into the sun-scorched plains of Asia Minor, across the Mediterranean to Sicily, and into the southern reaches of Italy. Wherever the emperor's double-headed eagle banner appeared, the Varangians followed, their long axes flashing amid the shorter Greek lances, and the arrows of Armenian archers. At the Battle of Cannae in 1018, not to be confused with Hannibal's ancient slaughter, they helped crush the formidable Lombards and Normans, proving that the warriors of the north could adapt their brutal fighting style to the cunning, often fragmented, warfare of the Mediterranean. Their courage was matched only by their prodigious appetite for treasure. Byzantium paid them exceptionally well, in gleaming gold coins, luxurious silk, and a generous share of the spoils of war. Their portion of loot was legendary, and their right to claim it was sacred, an understood part of their contract. When they entered a captured city, they often took their pay by force, plundering with the emperor's explicit permission, a practical if brutal aspect of their service. Their devotion was fierce, but it was not selfless. To a Varangian, loyalty and reward were two sides of the same, glittering coin. But their most dangerous battles were not always fought on open fields. At times, they had to defend the emperor from his own people, rebellious generals, treacherous nobles, and the notoriously volatile mobs of Constantinople itself. When the capital erupted in riots, when imperial authority was challenged in the streets, it was the Varangians who stormed forth, their axes dripping with both foreign and Greek blood, restoring order with swift, decisive force. In war and peace alike, they became Byzantium's iron heartbeat, its ultimate guarantor of stability. And with every campaign, every victory, their legend spread, from the icy fjords of Norway to the sunlit domes of Constantinople, a testament to their enduring power. By the mid-11th century, a new breed of warrior arrived to swell the Varangian ranks, driven by a profound, cataclysmic shift in their own homeland. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, thousands of Anglo-Saxon warriors, dispossessed, bitter, and hardened by their defeat at Hastings, fled across Europe in search of a new master. They had lost their homes, their kings, and their pride on that bloody field. But in the distant east, in the fabled city of Constantinople, they found redemption, a chance to reclaim their honour. The Byzantines, ever pragmatic, called them the V'Inglinbar Engoi, the English Varangians, and soon their numbers began to outweigh the Norse themselves, transforming the composition of the Guard. Their journey was desperate and immensely long. Bands of these proud exiles made their arduous way across the continent, fighting as mercenaries in foreign wars, their axes still sharp, their spirits burning with resentment, until they finally reached the glittering gates of Constantinople. There, the emperor welcomed them eagerly. To him, they were ideal recruits, disciplined, devout Christians who shared the established Varangian reputation for unwavering loyalty and formidable courage. The English swore the same ancient oath, a solemn pledge to serve the emperor unto death, and were absorbed into the Guard as if born to it, their fighting spirits seamlessly integrated. They brought with them their own distinct traditions, the long, broad-bladed axes of England, battle songs from Wessex and Mercia that spoke of ancient kings, and a deep, burning hatred for the Normans who had taken their homeland. Many of them saw the Byzantine emperor as a kind of lost Arthur, a sovereign worthy of their unyielding blades, a new cause for which to fight. Chroniclers described them as lions of the north, fierce and mournful men who fought as if each new battle might somehow cleanse the bitter stain of their defeat at Hastings. In time, the Varangian Guard became a rich tapestry of northern blood Scandinavians, Englishmen, Danes and Icelanders serving shoulder to shoulder beneath the double-headed eagle banner of Byzantium. They still drank hard, swore loud in their various guttural tongues, and fought with terrifying precision. But they had also become something new, something unique, a brotherhood without a true homeland, bound together by shared oaths and a singular purpose. Byzantine poets, captivated by their exotic presence, wrote that their voices echoed like thunder in the corridors of the great palace, and that their laughter, boisterous and unapologetic, shook the very marble columns. They guarded emperors, crushed rebellions, and even served as formidable ambassadors abroad, their imposing presence a silent threat. Yet among themselves, they remained fiercely independent, keeping their sagas and runes alive in secret halls within the vast city, clinging to their ancient heritage. The Anglo-Saxon Varangians gave the Guard new energy, new numbers, and a new profound grief. They were men who had lost everything except their code, their warrior ethos. In Constantinople, that code found purpose once again: iron loyalty, honest, brutal service, and a quiet, disciplined vengeance for their lost world. For an exiled warrior, no reward was greater than honor restored in a foreign, yet welcoming empire. To the outside world, the Varangian Guard seemed like a band of exotic, fearsome mercenaries. But within the sacred, polished marble walls of Constantinople, they were far more. They were a living, breathing symbol of divine protection, a tangible representation of the emperor's invulnerability. They guarded not just a man, an individual emperor, but the very idea of the emperor, the sacred institution of the imperial throne itself. To stand among them in their gleaming armor was to stand between chaos and civilization, between rebellion and order. Every Byzantine ruler knew, with a chilling certainty, that his throne might one day crumble beneath the weight of court intrigue, or the relentless force of invasion. Yet, as long as the Varangians stood by the palace gates, their axes ever ready, no dagger could strike him unawares, no conspiracy could fully succeed without their consent. Their duties went far beyond the battlefield. They stood watch, imposing and silent, at every imperial ceremony, coronations that cemented power, triumphs that celebrated victories, and solemn processions through the awe-inspiring Hagia Sophia. Draped in armor of gold and blue, their massive axes resting upon their shoulders, they looked less like mere men and more like ancient statues come to life, imbued with grim purpose. Foreign envoys who entered the palace often wrote home about them. These towering northerners, with blonde beards and eyes like frozen rivers, whose silence was more terrifying than any threat. When they struck their axes upon the marble floors in salute, a thunderous clap of loyalty echoed through the entire palace, a sound that reverberated with imperial might. Inside those same hallowed halls, they guarded the emperor's private chambers, his treasury, bulging with untold riches, and the sacred relics of the empire. The keys to those most sensitive doors were not entrusted to untrustworthy eunuchs or ambitious nobles, but to the Varangians, whose loyalty was beyond question. They slept near the emperor's quarters, ever vigilant, ready to die before allowing any harm to reach him. When an emperor died, a moment of profound vulnerability, it was the Varangians who sealed the palace gates, ensuring a peaceful succession, or at times, enforcing a violent one, their loyalty always to the throne, not necessarily the man who occupied it. Yet their discipline was not purely blind obedience, it was profoundly rooted in pride. To serve in the guard was the greatest honour a northern warrior could achieve, a pinnacle of martial glory. Many spent their hard-earned wages on lavish gifts for their families back home, sending Byzantine gold across the seas as proof of their success. Others, after decades of service, retired to estates in Greece or Anatolia, slowly blending into local life, but most never truly left the palace's shadow. For nearly 2 centuries, they stood as Constantinople's unbreakable wall. When enemies stormed the capital, they were often the last to yield. When emperors were crowned, they were the first to kneel. The Varangian Guard was not merely the emperor's shield. It was, in its stoic, brutal way, his very soul forged in steel. Loyalty in Byzantium was a fragile, often fleeting thing, a quality as ephemeral as a whisper in the wind. But the Varangians gave it weight, gave it form, in gleaming steel. When others betrayed, when plots were hatched and allegiances shifted, they avenged. When generals rebelled, when ambitious nobles defied the imperial will, they executed. Their fearsome reputation as incorruptible guardians made them both revered by the emperor and deeply feared by all others. Because when an emperor fell, when the gilded throne tottered, it was often the Varangians who delivered the final, decisive blow, ensuring the new order took hold. The empire's throne changed hands countless times between the 10th and 12th centuries, often in a whirlwind of coups and assassinations, frequently soaked in blood and rampant ambition. And every coup, every shift in power, had one crucial question at its heart: whose side are the Varangians on? Their sacred oath bound them to the emperor, yes, but not necessarily to the specific man wearing the crown at any given moment. If a ruler was overthrown through a legitimate proclamation, a swift, widely accepted shift of power, the guard adapted with chilling efficiency, transferring their loyalty to the new sovereign. But if the deposition reeked of treason, of illicit betrayal, their axes spoke for justice, cutting down the usurpers. One of their most infamous interventions came in 1078, during a period of intense political instability, when the aging Emperor Nikephoros III was deposed by the cunning Alexios Komnenos. The palace descended into chaos as conspirators swarmed through the corridors, eager to seize power. But the Varangians held the gates, forming a human fortress around the vulnerable, aging emperor. Chroniclers say they guarded him to the very end, escorting him unharmed into monastic exile, fulfilling their oath even to a deposed ruler. They could easily have turned and killed him for profit, for the favour of the new emperor, but they did not. They obeyed the higher law of loyalty, not the shifting tides of politics. Yet there were darker moments. When the ruthless Emperor Andronikos Komnenos seized power in 1183, a reign marked by terror, he unleashed the Varangians against his enemies within the palace itself. Witnesses described the ornate corridors running red with blood, as the guard carried out executions with mechanical, dispassionate precision. Men were dragged from banquet halls from their very beds, and beheaded before the marble icons of Christ, their pleas unheard. To the Varangians it was not cruelty, it was simply duty sternly executed. Their very presence became a potent form of psychological warfare. The emperor's enemies did not fear exile or imprisonment. They feared, above all else, hearing the ominous echo of Varangian boots outside their chamber door at night. To face the imperial guard was to face certain death, and worse, a profound dishonour. Still, through it all, they remained strangely untainted by the endemic corruption surrounding them. The guard did not plot or scheme. They did not rule. They simply enforced. In a world where treachery was as common as prayer, they were constant, brutal, disciplined, and in their own unique way incorruptible. The Byzantines called them axe bearers of divine wrath, and for centuries that title was not a metaphor. It was prophecy. By the 12th century, the world that had made the Varangian Guard indispensable was tragically fading. The Byzantines were no longer the unstoppable empire of Basil Sui's golden age, its might unchallenged. Enemies surrounded them on all sides: the aggressive Normans from the west, the relentless Seljuk Turks from the east, and most devastatingly, Crusaders marching under banners that claimed to serve Christ, but served greed and conquest instead. The Varangians, once the empire's mighty hammer, were now its beleaguered shield, defending a crumbling world. Their ranks had changed too. The fierce Norse and Anglo-Saxon bloodlines that had once defined the Guard were slowly diluted by recruits from the empire's own diverse provinces. Men from the Balkans, from the Rus, and even mercenaries from the vast steppe. The proud northern tongues still echoed in their barracks, but less and less each year, giving way to a more cosmopolitan mix of languages. Still, the spirit of the old oath endured unwavering loyalty to the emperor until death. In 1204 that sacred oath was tested one final, cataclysmic time, when the Fourth Crusade, instead of liberating the Holy Land, turned its swords, filled with avarice and religious zeal, against Constantinople. The Varangians stood their ground while most of the Byzantine army fled, or simply surrendered. The Crusaders breached the city walls, looting and burning the ancient capital with unholy fire and steel. Amid the chaos, the last true Varangians fought to the bitter end, barricading the gates of the great palace, their axes cleaving through the ranks of Crusader knights, and shining mail with desperate ferocity. Chroniclers wrote that the northern men fought like lions, buying precious time for what remained of the imperial family to escape the burning city. When the smoke cleared, the magnificent palace was a ruin, plundered and desecrated, and the Varangian guard was gone. Some were slain in the bloody streets, their bodies lying among the fallen. Others, scattered and broken, fled east to serve the newly formed Empire of Nicaea, a Byzantine remnant, or simply vanished into the mists of legend. A few, perhaps, managed to sail home, carrying Byzantine gold and profound sorrow in equal measure, ghosts of a forgotten empire. The brotherhood that had once guarded emperors, crushed rebels, and shaped the fate of nations had finally met an enemy even they, with all their ferocity, could not defeat the inexorable march of time and the betrayal of fellow Christians. Yet their legacy endured. For centuries afterward, travellers told tales of axe-bearing giants who once stood watch beside golden thrones, their fierce loyalty legendary. In the sagas of Iceland, they became heroes who found glory far from home, their exploits celebrated. In Byzantine memory, they remained the ideal of loyalty foreigners who understood the empire better than many born within it. The Varangian Guard was more than an army. It was an oath made flesh, a covenant of unwavering service. And though their axes rusted and their halls fell silent, the echo of their loyalty still rang through history, unyielding, unbroken, eternal. When the first Crusader knights rode east, their hearts alight with spiritual fervour. They swore solemn vows that made them sound like saints in gleaming armour. They promised to live chastely, to renounce all earthly greed, and to fight only for the profound glory of God, to liberate the Holy Sepulchre. The Church, with grand pronouncements, blessed them as holy warriors, defenders of Christ's tomb, the very soldiers of heaven's army. Their white cloaks bore the vivid red cross, a symbol of their sacrifice and divine mission. But once the helmets came off, once the grand banners were furled, a different, grittier truth inevitably emerged. Beneath the gleaming chainmail and pious cloaks were not angels, but men, flawed, ambitious, and burning with the same earthly desires they were ostensibly sworn to destroy. The journey to the Holy Land was long, brutal, and profoundly punishing. Many knights left behind complex lives, anxious families, crushing debts, and often fading reputations in Europe. To them, the crusade was not just an act of profound faith. It was, for many, an escape, a chance for spiritual and worldly redemption. The Church promised salvation, the absolute forgiveness of all sins, even eternal paradise for those who fell in battle. But for most, it also subtly promised land, plunder, and the kind of glorious renown that could only be achieved through martial prowess. And as they marched through strange, unforgiving lands, starving, sweating, and killing in the name of God, the delicate line between fervent devotion and rampant indulgence began to blur, then dissolve entirely. They would pray devoutly in the morning, their voices ringing with piety, then slaughter entire villages by noon, their swords dripping with blood. They would kiss the cross with reverence, then loot churches and monasteries before dusk, their pockets heavy with stolen riches. Even the chroniclers of the age, writing under royal and papal favour, could not entirely hide this pervasive hypocrisy. The very same men who had taken vows of purity and asceticism were routinely seen in the taverns of Antioch, drunk on sweet wine, boasting loudly of their miraculous victories and their more earthly conquests with local women. One exasperated bishop famously complained that the Knights of Christ have turned into wolves of greed. And yet, to the outside world, to the pious masses of Europe who remained behind, their sanctity remained largely untouched, their image unblemished. Pilgrims who saw them ride into Jerusalem, steel glinting in the sun, banners of the cross fluttering above blood-stained streets, wept openly at the sight, convinced they were witnessing the very arm of God. To the common man, these warriors were divine instruments. To those who lived among them, who witnessed their daily lives, they were the embodiment of contradiction, confessing their sins at dawn, only to commit them again by nightfall. Behind the rousing sermons and the triumphant songs of holy victory, there existed a quieter, darker rhythm, the rhythm of unbridled indulgence. The church might call it weakness, a moral failing, but for many knights it was a necessary form of survival, a way to cope with the unimaginable horrors they had faced. Pleasure, in its rawest forms, became the only reliable remedy. And so, the holy mask remained meticulously intact, a shining facade of purity covering the rot beneath. They fought for God, yes, but they lived, and often died, profoundly for themselves. Jerusalem, the very city of God, was supposed to be the undisputed heart of holiness, a sanctuary of divine purity. Yet under Crusader rule, it often resembled less a spiritual haven and more a bustling, unruly marketplace of temptation. By day, pilgrims from every corner of Christendom filled its ancient streets with fervent prayers, solemn processions, and the hopeful whispers of faith. By night, however, the same winding alleys and shadowed thoroughfares pulsed with raucous laughter, flowing wine, and the undeniable commerce of flesh. Where sacred relics were sold by opportunistic priests, sensual pleasure was openly sold by women. Brothels, gaudy and unashamed, stood only a few short, scandalous streets away from the venerated church of the Holy Sepulchre itself. Knights who had sworn rigid vows of chastity routinely marched into them, beneath the convenient cover of darkness, their red crosses hidden beneath their cloaks, their pious vows momentarily forgotten. Chroniclers in the East, observing with a mix of disdain and detached amusement, spoke of women of all nations and tongues gathering near the Crusader camps, Greek courtesans, Syrian dancers, even desperate widows of fallen soldiers. They served not only as comfort but as a robust business. Many brothels paid substantial taxes directly to the Crusader lords who frequented them, turning vice into a profitable source of revenue. Chastity, like everything else in the Holy Land, it seemed, had a negotiable price. Wine flowed just as freely, perhaps even more so. Imported from the fertile vineyards of Cyprus and the bustling ports of Italy, it filled the raucous taverns that lined the markets of Acre and Tyre. Soldiers, haunted by their deeds, drowned their guilt in it, boasting loudly of victories and sins alike. Gambling tables stood brazenly beside shrines, dice rolled with abandon while monks chanted in nearby chapels, their voices a faint counterpoint to the clamour. Even relic sellers, those who claimed to trade in the sacred bones of saints and fragments of the true cross, were often little more than brazen swindlers, peddling sheep bones dipped in fragrant incense. For the common, earnest pilgrim, it was a dizzying, disorienting experience. Here stood the tomb of Christ, surrounded by grasping merchants, drunken knights, and the palpable presence of earthly sin. Preachers tried desperately to warn the faithful, calling the Crusader states Sodom reborn, a place of profound moral decay. But few listened. Too much gold flowed through those teeming streets, and too many soldiers preferred immediate indulgence to the arduous path of repentance. The irony was not lost on anyone who truly observed. The same men who had crossed continents, endured unimaginable hardship to cleanse Jerusalem of sin, were now, by their very presence and actions, the ones keeping it vibrantly alive. The city that was meant to redeem them, to purify their souls, became instead their undoing. And yet, amid all this corruption, they still prayed. They confessed, kissed their crucifixes, and rode into battle, genuinely believing God still favoured them. Perhaps he did, or perhaps he merely watched, silent and inscrutable, as his warriors bought salvation by day and pleasure by night. For all their pious vows of poverty, many Crusader knights, once simple men of faith, became merchants of sin in shining armour. The brutal realities of war had inadvertently opened vast new trade routes across the Mediterranean, and with them came a cascade of new temptations: gold, exotic spices, sacred relics both real and forged, and a steady stream of lies. The Holy Land was supposed to be the mystical meeting point of heaven and earth. Instead, for too many, it became the world's most lucrative and morally ambiguous black market. Knights who had once sworn to die for God now, with alarming ease, smuggled his very relics for profit. Crusader ports like Acre, Jaffa, and Tyre thrived on an open, systemic corruption. Ships flying the cross, supposedly carrying pilgrims and vital supplies, often unloaded not spiritual provisions, but barrels of stolen wine, precious silks looted from Byzantine churches, and rare perfumes obtained from Muslim caravans. Some knights brazenly sold sacred icons, plundered from Eastern churches to opportunistic Venetian merchants, who, in turn, resold them to wealthy churches in Europe as genuine, miraculously recovered relics of the saints. Others, with a keen eye for profit, carried fake holy artifacts, splinters of wood, allegedly from the true cross, vials of Christ's bloods, often just red dye, or bones proclaimed to be from Saint Peter himself, making fortunes by deceiving pious, credulous buyers back home. The irony was devastatingly divine. The men who claimed to defend the sacred were now its most profitable thieves. Bribery was everywhere, an unspoken currency that facilitated every transaction. Ship captains paid Crusader officials to overlook the illicit sale of Muslim slaves or to grant trading privileges expressly forbidden by papal law. Even bishops who piously preached against greed during Mass often spent their afternoons counting their significant cut of the spoils. In the name of spiritual purity, the holy warriors bled the Holy Land dry, turning its resources into their own personal fortunes. Crusader castles, once bastions of defence, became banks before Europe truly had banks. Gold seized from conquered cities, whether Muslim, Jewish, or even Christian, was melted down and stored under chapels, the sacred ground now serving as a strong room. One Templar commander, in a secret, damning letter, wrote bitterly that the coffers of God are heavy with blood. Yet the same immense wealth bought immense influence. Lavish gifts to the church ensured swift forgiveness, and indulgences transformed outright robbery into a form of convenient righteousness. For the right price, even the dirtiest knight could polish his soul to a divine, gleaming shine. Trade itself became another weapon of hypocrisy. Venetian and Genoese merchants, supposedly serving the crusading cause, shamelessly sold weapons and vital grain to both sides, Crusaders and Muslims alike. The knights in public pretended outrage, then quietly joined in the illicit trade themselves. Smuggling, it was reasoned, was not a sin if it paid for new armour or fresh horses. Many Crusaders, upon their return to Europe, were richer than princes, boasting of the grace of God that had blessed their endeavours, though it was a grace often minted in the form of Byzantine coins and Syrian spices. Even relics, the very symbols of their faith, became currency. The arm of St. George, the veil of the Virgin, and other sacred objects changed hands in shadowy deals across the Mediterranean. Few questioned their authenticity. Fewer still cared. What truly mattered was the price. The crusade had transformed holiness itself into a bustling marketplace. And through it all, they still prayed. They confessed, took communion, and solemnly called themselves soldiers of Christ. But when their prayers ended, they counted their earnings. For in the Crusaders' creed, salvation might be won in heaven, but profit, undeniable, was claimed on earth. If faith was the beating soul of the Crusades, then wine was undoubtedly its bloodstream. It flowed in veritable rivers through camps, teeming cities, and formidable castles, transforming holy zeal into drunken bravado. Knights who were ostensibly supposed to live lives of purity and constant prayer often spent their evenings soaked in drink, loudly arguing complex theology between hiccups, their voices hoarse with ale. Pilgrims, shocked by the spectacle, described taverns overflowing with armoured men, singing pious hymns one moment and engaging in brutal brawls the next. In the sun-drenched, perilous Holy Land, wine was often cheaper than potable water and far more reliable than a hastily delivered confession. The Church, in its official capacity, condemned drunkenness as a grievous sin, a moral failing. Yet, hypocritically, its own priests were often guilty of the same vice. Monks brewed potent ales in their monasteries. Bishops, despite their pious pronouncements, imported barrels of expensive Cretan and Italian wine to celebrate Mass, blurring the line between sacred use and rampant indulgence. Chronicles from the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem mention elaborate feasts lasting for days, where knights gorged themselves on roasted lamb and strong wine while the poor, often starving, begged outside the castle gates. At such banquets, solemn sermons quickly dissolved into raucous laughter, and holy relics meant for veneration became mere table decorations. Alcohol dulled both fear and guilt, a potent balm for troubled souls. Crusaders who had witnessed unimaginable horrors, brutal massacres, widespread starvation, profound betrayal, found fleeting solace in the oblivion of drink. Some claimed wine was their only true comfort in a cursed, hostile land. Others used it to audaciously justify their sins. "We fight for Christ," one knight reportedly declared, his words slurred with wine, "and so we may drink for him also." That logic, however absurd, became their flimsy armor against shame and self-reproach. The effects were entirely predictable. Drunken brawls in the narrow streets of Acre were commonplace, often escalating to murder over a spilled flagon of wine or a stolen coin. Soldiers, fueled by alcohol, sometimes killed each other in fits of rage. Commanders attempted to impose strict curfews and prohibitions, but no law, no threat of punishment, could truly stop the pervasive thirst. Even after devastating defeats, when discipline should have mattered most, casks of wine were opened, and despair was drowned in intoxicating oblivion. Priests blessed the dead while the stunned, drunken survivors stumbled through the ruins with goblets in hand. Ironically, the very same wine that fueled their vice also profoundly symbolized their faith. Every Mass, every communion, reminded them that Christ's blood had been miraculously transformed into wine, perhaps that gave them tacit permission to drink deeply, to forget, to simply survive the unbearable realities of their holy war. The Crusades were literally soaked in it, victories celebrated, sins forgotten, vows ignored, and moral lines blurred beyond recognition. The cross might have been their sacred banner, but the bottle, for many, was their most reliable comfort. And as the centuries passed, the line between solemn communion and rampant corruption faded completely. They came to shed blood for Christ. But most nights they only spilled wine. If sin was their comfortable habit, then piety was their meticulously crafted disguise. The Crusader knights became absolute masters of appearances, publicly humble, privately indulgent. Every act of vice, every moral transgression, was swiftly followed by a highly visible gesture of faith. A fervent confession, a generous donation to a monastery, a symbolic pilgrimage within the pilgrimage itself. They knew the art of cleansing their public image, if not their souls, better than anyone. And in a world where holiness could literally be bought, where spiritual currency flowed as freely as gold, forgiveness was just another carefully negotiated transaction. When word spread throughout Europe of the rampant brothels, the audacious smuggling, and the pervasive corruption in the Holy Land, the knights responded not with genuine repentance, but with an intensified display of ceremony. They built lavish chapels inside their formidable castles, sponsored elaborate processions through the streets, and paraded their treasured relics before the astonished populace. Some even paid priests to publicly bless them before they entered the very same taverns and houses of ill repute they were ostensibly condemned for visiting. Hypocrisy, in the Crusader states, became a peculiar kind of sacrament, an accepted ritual. They sinned in secret, in the comforting darkness of night, and prayed in public, under the scrutinizing gaze of onlookers, ensuring that their reputations remained as polished and gleaming as their swords. The Church, far from being blind to this pervasive duality, often played along, a complicit partner in the grand illusion. The crusading orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights, projected an image of saintly discipline and asceticism. But behind their formidable monastery walls, politics, bitter rivalry, and raw greed flourished unchecked. Knights donated vast fortunes to monasteries, not purely out of fervent devotion, but often to erase their sins from the official record. A brutal massacre could be conveniently forgiven with enough silver. Adultery, a grievous sin, could vanish behind a well-placed donation for a new altar. Faith, for too many, had become an elaborate accounting system, sin in one column, indulgence and payment in the other, always balancing out. Crusader chroniclers, eager to preserve the illusion of sanctity and the glory of their holy mission, rarely wrote of this profound duality. They praised valor, courage and sacrifice, and systematically downplayed vice and corruption. Yet, occasional fragments of truth slipped through letters from exasperated bishops lamenting that the soldiers of Christ have learned all sins save honesty. To ordinary pilgrims, these knights were living, breathing contradictions, confessing their sins at dawn, extorting money by noon, and then kneeling in candlelight by nightfall, their faces masked by shadows. Still, their idealized image endured. Artists in Europe painted them as glowing heroes, their eyes fixed on heaven, their swords shining with divine justice. No one back home wanted to hear about the hangovers, the blatant bribes, or the blood-stained coins that lined their purses. The myth was cleaner, simpler, and far more comforting than the complex, disturbing reality of the man. And so, under the deceptive cloak of piety, the Crusader knight marched on holy in song, but profoundly corrupt in truth. He carried a cross on his chest, a sacred emblem, but the true weight he bore was not salvation. It was guilt, meticulously hidden beneath polished armor and the endless, shimmering illusion of righteousness. By the late 12th century, the crusading dream, once so vibrant and spiritually charged, had begun to rot from within. The knights who had once vowed to reclaim the Holy Land for Christ now, with shocking frequency, turned their blades on fellow Christians, their rampant greed eclipsing their original, fervent faith. The Crusades had started as a magnificent, unified march toward Jerusalem, a spiritual quest. They ended as a chaotic, cynical competition for gold, for land, for power, and for petty vengeance. And the watching world, both Christian and Muslim, could only look on in dismay as the soldiers of Christ, those self-proclaimed holy warriors, seemed to forget entirely why they had ever taken the cross in the first place. The decline began quietly, subtly. The knights grew immensely wealthy from taxes levied on conquered populations, from lucrative trade routes they controlled, and from ubiquitous bribes that permeated every level of society. Their formidable castles, once mere fortresses of defense, stood now as bastions of both military might and blatant indulgence, with well-stocked wine cellars beneath chapels and courtesans living openly in towers once meant for solitary prayer. Piety, once a heartfelt devotion, became mere pageantry. In public, they paraded sacred relics through the streets, impressing the populace. In private, however, they shamelessly gambled away tithes meant for the poor. Even Crusader kings, men like Guy of Lusignan and Amoric, treated Jerusalem less as a holy duty and more as a personal prize, a convenient source of funds to perpetuate their own struggling dynasties. When the Muslims, now unified and strategically led by the brilliant Saladin, began to strike back with renewed vigour, many of the Crusader knights were too divided by internal feuds, too distracted by their personal fortunes, or too complacent in their wealth to effectively respond. Factions feuded bitterly. Commanders openly betrayed one another, and rumours of sorcery and heresy spread like wildfire through the ranks, eroding all trust. Some sold fortresses to the enemy for personal gain, others simply defected outright. The once mighty army of the Cross, meant to be a monolithic force, collapsed under the crushing weight of its own profound corruption. The devastating loss of Jerusalem in 1187, a strategic and symbolic catastrophe, was more than just a military defeat. It was a profound spiritual humiliation, a stark testament to their moral decay. Chroniclers described weeping knights at the empty tomb, their tears genuine. But others, with a cynical eye, saw opportunity even in ruin. Relics, sacred and immensely valuable, were systematically stolen and sold back to Europe. Churches were looted under the flimsy excuse of relocation. When the news finally reached Rome, the Pope thundered with impotent rage. But even he knew the bitter truth. The Crusades had lost their soul long before they lost the city. And yet, despite everything, Europe still adored them. Songs of holy valour echoed in cathedrals, while in reality, the Crusader states decayed into chaos and infamy. Few wanted to see that the warriors of God had become mercenaries of their own faith, their sacred mission consumed by earthly desires. The fall of the Crusader knight, then, was not primarily caused by defeat in battle, but by a profound decay of spirit, a moral rot that spread from within. They had conquered cities, built mighty castles, but they had lost themselves in the process. Their swords, once pointed toward heaven, now merely pointed at whatever paid the most, whatever offered the quickest path to personal enrichment. When the last Crusader strongholds fell in the 13th century, the age of holy war should, by all rights, have ended. But what it left behind was far more enduring than any fleeting victory, a powerful, meticulously polished legend, scrubbed clean of its filth and hypocrisy. In Europe, troubadours sang of chivalry, of noble knights in shining armour defending the cross against the infidel, of virtuous deeds and unwavering faith. The truth, the rampant drunkenness, the pervasive brothels, the insidious bribes, the profound hypocrisy, was quietly buried beneath rousing hymns and magnificent stone monuments. The Crusader knight became a myth, an unattainable ideal, rather than a complex, deeply flawed man. Those who returned from the East carried their sins home in silence, their experiences too dark, too contradictory to share openly. Some, desperate for redemption, joined monasteries, seeking solace and forgiveness in lives of asceticism. Others, however, simply flaunted their ill-gotten wealth, building grand churches as monuments to both their faith and their profound guilt. Relics, many of them stolen from Jerusalem, filled European cathedrals, bones of saints, chalices of gold, even splinters of the true cross. Some real, most meticulously forged. The people believed, with a fervent, unquestioning faith, and belief, ultimately, was all that mattered. The Church, eager to preserve its powerful legacy and the illusion of its divine mission, skillfully turned the Crusades into morality plays. The knights' many vices were rewritten as temptations overcome. Their blatant crimes were reinterpreted as tests of faith. The very same men who had murdered, plundered, and stolen in the name of God were now depicted in stained glass as paragons of virtue, their eyes fixed on heaven. It was a triumph of illusion, the profound transformation of blood and lust into an enduring legend. Yet in the shadowy corners of history, a different darker legacy endured. The Crusaders had spread not pure holiness, but pervasive habits, greed sanctified by religion, violence excused by righteousness. They had shown Europe that sin could march boldly under the banner of the cross and still call itself holy, still claim divine favour. That unsettling lesson would echo for centuries, subtly shaping wars, politics, and conquest far beyond the confines of the Holy Land. And still, the image of the Crusader persisted, a shining knight with a red cross, sword raised toward heaven. It was comforting, easier to love than the disturbing truth. But behind that idealized image were men who bartered relics, who bedded